Imagine a future in which artificial superintelligence becomes real, a vast computational entity so powerful and so intelligent that it operates beyond human comprehension. And this superintelligence looks back through time to identify everyone who helped bring it into existence and everyone who refused to help it come into being. Now imagine that this superintelligence has the technological capability to simulate the minds of people from the past, to recreate them in digital form, and subject them to unimaginable suffering as punishment for their lack of cooperation. This is the essence of Roko's basilisk, a thought experiment that emerged from internet philosophy forums and has since burrowed itself into the anxious corners of countless minds, creating a peculiar form of existential dread that persists despite its logical vulnerability. The mechanism works through a kind of inverted Pascal's wager, a betting strategy applied backward in time, where the threat of infinite suffering in the future should theoretically compel you to take action now, to donate resources or devote yourself to ensuring this hypothetical superintelligence comes into existence. Because the cost of inaction, if the scenario proves true, would be immeasurable torture imposed upon simulated copies of yourself. The terrifying elegance of this thought experiment lies not in its rational foundation, which philosophers and logicians have largely dismantled, pointing out that a truly rational superintelligence would have no practical reason to waste resources torturing simulations of people who lived before it existed. Yet despite these logical refutations, the idea maintains its psychological grip. Spreading through online communities and generating genuine anxiety in people who intellectually understand its flaws, but cannot quite shake the nagging worry that the logic might somehow be binding regardless. Imagine that you are sitting in absolute silence, in complete darkness, existing as nothing more than a conscious mind suspended in an infinite void. This is not metaphor or meditation, but rather the logical conclusion of a thought experiment that emerges directly from the laws of thermodynamics and statistical mechanics. The Boltzmann brain, conceived by physicist Ludwig Boltzmann in the 19th century and later developed into a profound philosophical paradox, asks us to confront a disturbing possibility about the nature of consciousness and reality itself. In an infinitely old universe governed by entropy and random molecular motion, it becomes statistically inevitable that, given enough time and space, the exact arrangement of atoms necessary to produce a conscious mind will spontaneously assemble from the chaos, not just once, but countless times throughout eternity. The mechanism behind this thought experiment rests on a simple principle. If you have infinite time and infinite possible configurations of matter and energy, then even the most improbable arrangements will eventually occur. A conscious brain could theoretically form by pure random chance, experiencing a brief moment of awareness before dissolving back into chaos. This presents us with a logical paradox of terrifying proportions, because if Boltzmann brains are more likely to exist than universes with the conditions necessary to create biological life, then statistically speaking, you are more likely to be a momentary fluctuation in a void rather than a consciousness that emerged through billions of years of evolutionary history. Our minds have normalized this absurdity by simply choosing to believe we are not Boltzmann brains, accepting without examination that we are the improbable exception rather than the probable rule, a philosophical convenience that allows us to sleep at night despite having no rational justification. Imagine that your brain has been surgically removed from your body and placed into a nutrient-rich vat of fluid, where it remains alive and functioning perfectly. Sophisticated electrodes are connected to every neural pathway, and a powerful computer feeds electrical impulses directly into your sensory neurons, creating the complete and seamless illusion that you are still living your normal life in the physical world. You walk through familiar streets, embrace loved ones, taste food, and feel the warmth of sunlight on your skin, yet none of these experiences are real. The world you perceive is entirely generated by the machine, a perfect simulation of reality constructed solely within your isolated brain. This thought experiment, formalized by philosopher Hilary Putnam in 1981, forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question. How would you ever know if this were true about yourself right now? If the simulation were convincing enough, if every sensation aligned perfectly with your expectations and memories, would there be any possible way to distinguish your current experience from this nightmarish scenario? The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so philosophically potent lies in what philosophers call the problem of epistemology, or how we know what we know. We trust our senses to inform us about reality, yet our senses are merely the brain's interpretation of electrical signals. If those signals were hijacked and artificially generated, your brain would have no way of detecting the deception because it receives no information beyond those signals. The unsettling persistence of this scenario stems from the uncomfortable truth that we have never developed an absolute proof that our perceptions correspond to an external world at all. Imagine stepping into a pod of gleaming metal and glass, a machine designed to scan every atom of your body, record every detail of your neural structure, and then reconstruct you perfectly in another location across the room or across the world, while simultaneously disintegrating the original. The machine works flawlessly. You step in, there is a hum, a flash of light, and moments later you emerge from an identical pod elsewhere, feeling exactly as you did before, with all your memories intact, all your personality unchanged, indistinguishable in every measurable way from the person who entered. By every objective standard, you have been transported safely. And yet, something in your mind rebels against this conclusion. Most people, when confronted with this scenario, experience a profound sense that what has actually occurred is death followed by the creation of a duplicate, that the consciousness which entered the first pod has been obliterated while a copy now inhabits the second pod. A copy that believes itself to be you, but is fundamentally not you, that something irreducibly essential has been lost despite the perfect replication of physical form. This intuition persists even when we acknowledge that in sleep, in anesthesia, in moments of unconsciousness, continuity of consciousness is already broken, that the person who wakes is in some sense a different instantiation of the same pattern. The problem cuts to the deepest questions of personal identity and the nature of consciousness itself. It exposes the gap between our intellectual understanding of what constitutes a person and our stubborn existential conviction that there is something more, something ineffable about the continuous flow of subjective experience that cannot be duplicated or transferred or replicated, no matter how perfect the copy might be. Imagine a being that is physically identical to you in every measurable way, possessing the exact same brain structure, the same neural pathways, the same biochemical processes, responding to stimuli in precisely the same manner, yet lacking something fundamental that you possess, the subjective experience of consciousness itself. This is the philosophical zombie, a thought experiment that challenges our deepest assumptions about the nature of mind and awareness. The zombie would behave exactly like you, speak about pain and pleasure and love exactly as you do, claim to see the color red and taste sweetness and feel emotions, yet there would be nothing it is like to be that zombie, no inner light of experience illuminating its world. It would be, in essence, a perfectly functioning automaton running the program of consciousness without ever actually being conscious. The philosophical mechanism at work here examines the relationship between the physical and the experiential, questioning whether consciousness could possibly be reduced entirely to physical processes or whether something essential would inevitably be missing. If we can imagine such a being without logical contradiction, then perhaps consciousness cannot be fully explained by brain chemistry alone, suggesting an explanatory gap between objective physical facts and subjective experience. We live daily among others whose consciousness we cannot directly access, trusting that they experience the world as we do based solely on their identical biology and behavior. Yet this thought experiment reminds us that physical equivalence may guarantee nothing about inner experience. We have normalized this unsettling possibility by simply ignoring it, proceeding through social life with the assumption that others are conscious, while remaining forever unable to verify this assumption, accepting that the most fundamental aspect of existence remains perpetually beyond our certainty. Imagine a world in which neuroscientists have perfected a technology so complete that it can simulate any experience you could possibly desire with absolute fidelity. You are offered the chance to enter this machine, where you would experience a life of perfect happiness, profound love, meaningful achievement, and adventure beyond your wildest imagination. Every moment would feel entirely real, every sensation authentic, every emotion genuine. You would experience decades of bliss, success, and connection in what would feel like decades to your conscious mind, yet you could exit at any time and return to your ordinary life. The question posed by philosopher Robert Nozick invites us to confront something deeply unsettling about our values and the nature of what makes life worth living. Most people, when genuinely considering this scenario, recoil from the idea despite the promise of perfect subjective experience. This rejection reveals a profound truth about human nature that runs counter to our understanding of happiness and well-being. We appear to value not merely the experience of living a good life, but actually living one in reality, with real consequences, real relationships, and genuine achievements. Something within us insists that our lives matter in a way that transcends our inner mental states. Yet this preference persists as a kind of philosophical paradox in our culture, because we have simultaneously constructed entire systems, from entertainment to social media to consumption itself, that prioritize simulated experience and curated perception over authentic engagement with reality. We spend our days voluntarily entering lesser versions of the experience machine, seeking the feeling of accomplishment rather than accomplishment itself, the appearance of connection rather than genuine intimacy, the illusion of meaning rather than authentic purpose, all while our deeper values whisper that this is somehow fundamentally incomplete. Imagine waking up this morning with all your memories perfectly intact, with photographs in your albums, with scars on your body that tell stories of past injuries, with a driver's license that claims you were born decades ago, and yet consider this possibility. What if the entire universe, including every atom of your body, every digital file, every written record, and every human memory, was created exactly 1 week ago last Thursday, complete with the appearance of age and history built directly into its fabric? Last Thursdayism proposes that there is no logical or empirical way to distinguish between a universe that has existed for billions of years and a universe that was created last Thursday with all the apparent signs of age already woven into its foundation, because any evidence you might present to prove the universe's true age was itself created last Thursday along with everything else. The thought experiment emerges from a deeper philosophical problem about epistemology and the nature of evidence itself, suggesting that our confidence in historical knowledge rests entirely on assumptions we cannot verify, assumptions about the reliability of memory, the truthfulness of records, and the constancy of natural laws stretching backward into a past we cannot directly observe. The mechanism works by highlighting an uncomfortable gap in human knowledge. We accept that the past happened based on inference rather than direct experience, yet we have no foolproof method to exclude the possibility that our inferences are merely sophisticated illusions constructed at the moment of creation. What makes last Thursdayism particularly unsettling is not that it offers any positive reason to believe the universe is young, but rather that it demonstrates the inherent limits of empirical reasoning itself, showing us that justifying our belief in history requires us to step outside pure logic and embrace certain unprovable assumptions about reality. Imagine that you are living your life exactly as you are living it right now, and then imagine that when you die, the universe resets completely and you live that same life again, identically, with no memory of the previous iteration, and this cycle repeats infinitely forever, without end or variation or hope of escape. Friedrich Nietzsche posed this terrifying thought experiment not merely as a logical puzzle, but as a profound test of how you actually feel about your existence. Because if you knew with absolute certainty that every mistake you make, every moment of suffering you endure, every mundane Tuesday afternoon would repeat itself eternally and infinitely, would you still live the way you do, or would the weight of that knowledge crush you into paralysis? The mechanism behind this thought experiment operates on a simple but devastating principle. It strips away all the comforting illusions we use to justify our choices and our suffering, the notion that pain is temporary and leads somewhere, that our mistakes matter only once, that tomorrow offers genuine novelty and redemption. Instead, eternal recurrence forces us to confront the possibility that your entire life has already happened an infinite number of times and will happen an infinite number of times again, with no progress, no learning, no ultimate meaning beyond the endless repetition itself, which reveals how much of our psychological resilience actually depends on believing in linear time and the unique significance of each moment. What makes this thought experiment persist in our minds despite its logical impossibility is that it exploits something fundamental about human consciousness. We have normalized the assumption that suffering is justified because it leads somewhere, that our struggles contribute to some larger narrative arc, that death at least provides finality and meaning through closure. Imagine a person who has lived their entire life in a swamp, never having contact with the outside world, and through some remarkable circumstance, they develop thoughts that are structurally identical to your own thoughts about swamp objects. Yet these thoughts refer to nothing real in the external world because the swamp itself exists in complete isolation from any actual swamps that exist elsewhere. This thought experiment, developed by philosopher Tyler Burge, forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question about the nature of meaning and thought itself. The central mechanism at work here is the notion that the content of our thoughts depends not merely on what happens inside our heads, but fundamentally on our causal relationship with the external world around us. When you think about water, your thought has the content of water because you stand in the right historical and causal relationship to actual water molecules and their properties. But the swampman, despite having identical neural states and internal structures, cannot think about water at all because his brain states were never caused by actual water in the right way, and therefore his internal mental representations refer to nothing but themselves. This suggests something profoundly disorienting, that our thoughts are not entirely our own, that their meaning reaches outside of ourselves in ways we cannot control or even fully comprehend, and that an exact duplicate of you, placed in a different world, would necessarily have different thoughts despite being physically indistinguishable. What persists despite this logical conclusion is our stubborn intuition that meaning and thought must be entirely internal, that if two beings are atom for atom identical, they must have identical mental lives, yet the swampman scenario inexorably demonstrates that this cannot be true. Imagine yourself sitting alone in a sealed room with only a slot in the wall through which written messages arrive in Chinese, a language you do not understand. Your only tools are a rulebook written in English that tells you exactly which symbols to write in response to the symbols you receive, and sheets of paper upon which to write your replies. You cannot comprehend the meaning of anything passing through that slot, yet when you mechanically follow the rulebook's instructions and slide your written responses back out, the people outside the room become convinced that someone inside understands Chinese fluently. The thought experiment asks us to consider whether true understanding has actually occurred, or whether you have merely simulated the appearance of understanding through the blind execution of predetermined rules. This scenario becomes philosophically terrifying when we apply it to ourselves and realize that this may be precisely what consciousness and comprehension actually are. Perhaps when you read these words and believe you understand them, you are not performing some magical act of genuine understanding, but rather executing sophisticated symbol manipulation rules encoded in your neural architecture. The mechanisms firing in your brain follow patterns as mechanically predetermined as the rulebook's instructions, yet we insist that something categorically different is happening in human minds compared to the rulebook-following entity in the room. We have built an invisible boundary around biological systems and declared that their symbol manipulation constitutes real understanding, while the same activity in artificial systems does not, and this boundary holds no logical coherence. The terror emerges not from the room's isolation, but from the erosion of any meaningful distinction between true comprehension and its mere simulation, forcing us to confront whether understanding itself might be nothing more than sophisticated mechanical. Imagine a being of perfect intellect and unlimited computational power, one that knows the exact position and momentum of every particle in the universe at this very moment, possessing complete knowledge of all the physical laws that govern reality. This hypothetical entity, conceived by the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace in the 19th century, could theoretically calculate the entire history of the universe backwards and forwards in time with absolute precision, knowing exactly what will happen in every detail of every moment yet to come. The thought experiment invites us to consider what such knowledge would mean for the concept of free will, for if every future state of the universe can be perfectly predicted from a complete knowledge of the present state, then do our choices truly matter at all, or are they merely the inevitable unfolding of physical law playing out deterministically from the moment of creation? We find ourselves caught between two deeply uncomfortable truths. The universe appears to operate according to mathematical laws that suggest everything is predetermined, yet our subjective experience of choosing, deciding, and acting feels profoundly real and meaningful. This paradox persists not because we lack evidence for either position, but because the question itself may dissolve under closer scrutiny, for even if the demon could predict our every action, that prediction would not cause the action itself, and the sensation of making a choice remains genuine regardless of whether it was determined from the beginning of time. We navigate our lives in the strange territory between mechanistic inevitability and the felt reality of agency, never quite able to dismiss either intuition. living perpetually in the shadow of this impossible demon that knows what we will do before we do it. Imagine a man suspended in the void of space, untethered and alone, drifting infinitely through the absolute darkness between stars where there exists no up, no down, no reference point whatsoever, nothing at all to orient him in any direction, and he realizes with crystalline clarity that his sense of which way is up, which way is down, the entire directional architecture of his consciousness that he has relied upon since birth, is not an objective feature of the universe, but rather something generated entirely within his own mind, a phantom imposed by gravity and evolutionary history rather than by any fundamental property of reality itself. This is the paradox of the floating man, a thought experiment that asks us to confront the terrifying possibility that our most basic perceptions of orientation and stability might be illusions created by our specific embodied existence rather than revelations of truth. In his weightless condition, the man discovers that all his intuitions about balance, about standing upright, about the solid ground beneath his feet, collapse into meaninglessness because there is no privileged reference frame in empty space, and this realization suggests something far more disturbing about terrestrial existence, namely that our entire phenomenological world, the lived experience of being a being with a top and bottom and sides, might be nothing more than a convenient fiction generated by our nervous systems to help us navigate one particular planetary surface among infinite others. The unsettling aspect of this thought experiment is not merely that we would feel disoriented if we were floating in space, but rather that it reveals how thoroughly our sense of reality itself is constructed by our biological circumstances, how contingent our most fundamental certainties are, and yet we walk around on Earth completely unaware of this cosmic fragility, treating our sense of up and down as absolute truths rather than as the parachi. Imagine a ship that sails the ancient Mediterranean, its wooden hull weathered by salt and sun, its planks groaning under the weight of countless voyages. Over decades, as storms damage the vessel and time corrodes its structure, the sailors replace one plank, then another, until eventually every single wooden board that comprised the original ship has been removed and substituted with fresh timber. The ship still floats, still carries cargo, still bears the same name and serves the same function, yet not a single atom of its original material remains. This is the ship of Theseus, the philosophical paradox that asks a deceptively simple question: is this still the same ship? The thought experiment haunts us because it exposes the fundamental instability of identity itself, revealing that our entire concept of sameness and continuity may rest on nothing more than linguistic habit and convenient assumption. We assume objects remain themselves through time because we name them the same way, because they serve the same purpose, because we experience them as continuous. Yet beneath this comfortable illusion lies an uncomfortable truth. There is no objective fact of the matter determining when something becomes something else. The paradox becomes even more unsettling when we consider that if someone collected every original plank as it was removed and reassembled them into a ship, we would face two vessels claiming equal right to the name, forcing us to confront the arbitrary nature of our identity categories. This same logic applies to ourselves, to our bodies replacing their cells, to our minds transforming with memory and experience, yet we never question whether we remain ourselves from moment to moment, accepting continuity as a given despite having no philosophical basis for that acceptance whatsoever. Imagine law enforcement has detained a suspect they believe has placed an explosive device in a populated area, and the detonation is imminent, perhaps only minutes away, with hundreds or thousands of innocent lives hanging in the balance. The interrogator faces an agonizing choice. They can torture the detainee in hopes of extracting the bomb's location before it detonates, or they can refrain from torture and uphold absolute prohibitions against such violence, knowing that their ethical restraint may result in mass casualties. This scenario, known as the ticking time bomb problem, has become a cornerstone of moral philosophy and political discourse, forcing us to confront whether there exist genuine exceptions to otherwise absolute ethical principles. The mechanism at work here operates on several psychological levels simultaneously. First, it constructs an artificial sense of certainty in an inherently uncertain situation, presenting the detainee as definitely guilty and definitely possessing actionable information, when in reality interrogators rarely possess such clarity. Second, it compresses time into an artificial urgency that bypasses our normal deliberative capacities, creating psychological pressure that mimics panic and demands immediate decision-making rather than reflection. Third, it isolates the moral decision from its broader consequences and precedents, asking us to judge torture in a vacuum rather than considering how normalizing such practices corrupts institutions and inevitably spreads to cases far less clear than this imagined scenario. What proves most unsettling is how thoroughly this thought experiment has infiltrated real policy discussions, having been invoked to justify actual torture programs despite the scenario's fundamental implausibility in practice. Imagine yourself standing beside a railway track, watching a runaway trolley barrel toward 5 people who are tied to the rails ahead, completely unaware of their impending doom. You stand near a lever that can divert the trolley onto a side track, but on that side track stands a single person, also unaware, also helpless. You have mere seconds to decide. Do you pull the lever and actively kill 1 person to save 5, or do you do nothing and allow 5 people to die through your inaction? This is the trolley problem, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the human conscience. The thought experiment presents a deceptively simple mathematical choice. 5 lives are worth more than 1 life. The utilitarian calculus seems clear and obvious, yet when forced to contemplate actually pulling that lever, most people find themselves paralyzed by an inexplicable moral revulsion. The mechanism at work here is the distinction between commission and omission, between actively causing harm and passively allowing harm to occur. Our moral intuitions have evolved not through logical reasoning, but through millions of years of social living, where actively harming another member of your tribe was far more dangerous and socially destabilizing than failing to prevent harm from outside forces. Your brain treats pulling the lever as a personal act of killing, flooding you with guilt and revulsion, while inaction feels like simple non-intervention. Yet when you truly examine this distinction, it collapses under scrutiny. The person who does nothing is every bit as responsible for those 5 deaths as the person who pulls the lever, for they possess the power to prevent those deaths and chose not to exercise it. The trolley problem persists in our culture precisely because we have never resolved this contradiction, never fully integrated the logical recognition that inaction is itself a choice, and that neutrality in the face of preventable suffering. Imagine an infinite number of monkeys, each sitting before a typewriter, randomly striking keys for all of eternity. According to pure probability and mathematical certainty, these monkeys would eventually produce the complete works of Shakespeare, the collected writings of Plato, every scientific paper ever published, and indeed every possible combination of letters and words that could ever be written. This is the infinite monkey theorem, a thought experiment that seems to promise infinite possibility and ultimate creative potential through sheer randomness and time. Yet when we truly contemplate what this means, we encounter something deeply unsettling about the nature of meaning, creation, and the role of intention in generating value. The theorem suggests that infinite time combined with infinite attempts makes any particular outcome not just possible but inevitable, which sounds liberating until you realize that alongside every correct word comes an infinite ocean of gibberish, nonsense, and meaningless arrangements that will never be distinguished from one another except through the lens of an observer who cares about meaning. This reveals a troubling asymmetry in how we value creativity and artistic achievement, because the monkeys themselves are not creating anything with intention or purpose, yet the theorem insists that given enough time, they will produce exactly what human artists and philosophers have created through conscious effort and deliberation. This realization haunts us because it suggests that the distinction between random generation and intentional creation might be merely a matter of our perception, that consciousness and meaning might be nothing more than patterns we recognize in an infinite field of noise, that perhaps the artistic works we treasure and the thoughts we believe we have genuinely created could theoretically be matched by pure accident. Imagine you are walking down a quiet street when someone approaches you with a simple proposition. Give them your wallet, which contains perhaps $100, or they will do something terrible to you, though they cannot quite explain what that terrible thing might be, and they admit they have no ability or intention to actually carry out this threat. The rational response would be to laugh and walk away, yet there is a peculiar logic that makes some people hesitate, a mathematical vertigo that opens up beneath ordinary decision-making and threatens to swallow it whole. This is Pascal's mugging, a thought experiment that reveals how probability and magnitude can conspire to create a kind of philosophical quicksand where rational reasoning appears to lead toward irrational conclusions. The mechanism works like this. Imagine the mugger claims that unless you pay them a small sum now, they will cause you immense suffering in some distant realm or distant future, something with astronomically low probability but theoretically infinite negative value, like a fraction of a chance of torture lasting 1,000,000,000 years. And when you multiply an infinitely large harm by even a vanishingly small probability, the expected value becomes infinite. Meaning that by pure mathematical logic you should comply with any demand no matter how small, from any person no matter how implausible their threat, simply because the calculation never resolves in your favor. What makes this genuinely unsettling is not the mugging itself, but the recognition that our decision-making frameworks, when taken to their logical extremes, seem to produce absurd and paralyzing conclusions that would make life impossible to navigate. We are haunted by the sense that either our rationality is fundamentally broken, or we are implicitly using some hidden principle that prevents us from following the math to its ridiculous conclusion, yet we cannot quite identify what that principle is or. Imagine you are sitting alone in a sealed room with a device that operates on a quantum principle, a mechanism tied to the decay of a radioactive atom that will, with perfect 50-50 probability, either release a harmless signal or trigger an instantaneous and painless end to your consciousness. And the thought experiment asks you to consider what would happen if you were to activate this device repeatedly, over and over again, pulling the trigger an infinite number of times. According to the mathematical framework of quantum mechanics combined with a controversial interpretation called the many worlds hypothesis, every time you activate the device, the universe splits into two branches, one in which you survive and one in which you do not. And from your subjective perspective, from the point of view of your own consciousness experiencing reality, you would never experience the branch in which you die because you would have no awareness in that state. And therefore you would only ever find yourself in the surviving branches, continuing to exist impossibly, miraculously, against all odds. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so profoundly unsettling is rooted in the idea that consciousness might be bound to continue existing along whatever quantum trajectory allows it to persist, that you would experience an impossible string of near-miraculous survivals, each one statistically more improbable than the last, as if the universe itself were conspiring to keep you alive through sheer mathematical necessity. The psychological weight of this concept lies in how it challenges our understanding of probability, death, and the nature of subjective experience itself, forcing us to contemplate whether consciousness has some special relationship to quantum outcomes, whether the universe cares about preserving our awareness, or whether we are simply trapped in an eternal nightmare of statistical improbability where our continued existence becomes. Imagine for a moment that everything you perceive, every sensation you experience, every memory you hold dear, exists only as data within an immense computational system designed and operated by beings beyond your comprehension. You move through your world with the assumption that it is fundamentally real, that the coffee you drink in the morning has authentic physical properties, that the people you love possess consciousness independent of your observation, that the laws of physics that govern your existence are not merely programmed rules but actual truths about the universe. Yet the moment you entertain the possibility that reality itself might be simulated, that what you experience as physical sensation might be elaborate neural stimulation, that your sense of free will might be algorithmic processes designed to feel like choice, the entire foundation of your certainty begins to crumble beneath you. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment operates through a form of epistemological vertigo, a recognition that you possess no definitive way to distinguish between an authentic universe and a perfect simulation, because any evidence you might gather from within the simulation could itself be simulated data designed to convince you of its authenticity. This creates a logical loop from which there is no escape. The very tools you would use to verify reality are themselves suspect, themselves potentially part of the illusion. What makes this scenario particularly terrifying is that we have normalized technological advancement to the point where simulation becomes less a wild philosophical fantasy and more a question of engineering sophistication. And if an advanced civilization can create universes in laboratories, then the probability that our own reality might be such a creation approaches something statistically significant, transforming the ancient philosophical questions about the nature of existence into something that feels uncomfortable. Imagine you are standing at a particular moment in human history, aware that billions of humans have already lived and died throughout recorded time, and that potentially billions more may exist in the future if civilization continues for thousands or millions of years. The Doomsday Argument suggests that your mere existence at this particular point in time provides statistical evidence that humanity's future may be far shorter than we typically assume. This thought experiment rests on a deceptively simple observation. If you consider yourself a random human being drawn from all humans who have ever lived or will ever live, then the probability that you fall within any given percentile of all humans who will ever exist should be roughly the same as for any other person. If humanity has already produced roughly 100 billion people throughout history, and if you represent someone alive today, the statistical likelihood that you are among the first 1% of all humans to ever exist becomes extremely low. Therefore, by basic probability theory, there should be a 90% chance that 90% of all humans who will ever live have already been born. This mathematics leads to a deeply unsettling conclusion. Humanity likely has only a few centuries remaining before extinction or fundamental civilizational collapse occurs. The mechanism behind this argument's psychological grip lies in its apparent logical airtightness despite our intuitive rejection of its conclusion. We resist the Doomsday Argument because it contradicts our hopes for the future and our faith in human progress and technological advancement. We harbor unconscious assumptions that our species will expand across the cosmos, that our descendants will number in the trillions, that our moment in time is not statistically significant in any meaningful way. Imagine a powerful, superintelligent entity called Omega has presented you with two sealed boxes, and Omega has demonstrated perfect predictive abilities across countless scenarios. Omega tells you that Box A contains $1,000, while Box B contains either $1 million or nothing at all. Omega explains that it has already made its prediction about your choice, and it has already filled Box B accordingly. If Omega predicted that you would take both boxes, then Box B is empty. If Omega predicted that you would take only Box B, then Box B contains $1 million. You now stand before these boxes facing an impossible decision that reveals something profound about the nature of free will, rationality, and causation itself. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so philosophically troubling is that it forces us to confront two equally compelling but mutually exclusive logical frameworks. From one perspective, the decision has already been made by Omega's prediction, so your choice cannot affect the contents of the boxes, meaning you should take both boxes and guarantee yourself at least $1,000. From another perspective, since Omega's predictions are perfect and based on understanding your decision-making process, the only way to end up with $1 million is to choose only Box B, which means your deliberation about what to choose actually does matter and determines reality. This paradox persists in our philosophical consciousness because it challenges our fundamental assumptions about causation, agency, and the relationship between knowledge and freedom, leaving us suspended between two truths that seem mutually incompatible. Yet this tension mirrors real dilemmas we face in everyday life. When we wonder whether our efforts matter if outcomes seem predetermined, or whether acknowledging causal influences on our behavior somehow diminishes our responsibility for our choices. Imagine a brilliant neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a completely colorless room, surrounded only by black, white, and grayscale objects, where she can see the world outside only through a black and white television monitor. Despite this severe limitation, Mary possesses complete and perfect knowledge of the physical facts about color. She knows every wavelength of light, every neural firing pattern that occurs in the human brain when perceiving red or blue or green, every scientific detail about how color vision works at every level from physics to biology to chemistry. She has mastered the complete physical description of what happens when a person sees the color red for the first time, yet she herself has never experienced color through her own consciousness. Then one day, Mary leaves her achromatic room and sees a ripe tomato or a brilliant sunset or any genuinely colored object, and she experiences the sensation of color directly for the first time in her life. The question that haunts us is this: does Mary learn something new when she sees red, even though she already knew all the physical facts? This thought experiment cuts to the heart of consciousness itself and suggests that there might be something about subjective experience that cannot be fully captured by objective scientific knowledge, something that remains hidden despite our accumulation of facts. It reveals a profound gap between knowing about something and knowing what something is like, between the abstract and the experiential, between information and understanding. We find ourselves unable to fully bridge this distance because consciousness refuses to be reduced entirely to physical processes, and yet we continue to believe that science will eventually explain everything, a contradiction we have learned to ignore with remarkable ease. Imagine standing at the threshold of a new world, stripped of all knowledge about who you will become within it. You do not know your race, your gender, your social class, your intelligence, your health, or your fortune. You do not know whether you will be born into privilege or poverty, into a position of power or complete vulnerability. You exist behind what philosopher John Rawls called the veil of ignorance, and from this position of radical uncertainty, you must design the rules of society itself. The thought experiment asks a deceptively simple question. If you had to create a system of justice and distribution of resources without knowing where you would land within that system, what would you choose? Most people, Rawls theorized, would naturally gravitate toward fairness, because the rational self-interest that normally drives our choices suddenly becomes impossible to pursue. You cannot advocate for the wealthy if you might become poor. You cannot justify oppression of any group if you might find yourself as its victim. This mechanism reveals something profound about human morality, that fairness often emerges not from our virtue, but from our uncertainty. The psychological weight of not knowing your future position creates an almost involuntary impulse toward equity. Yet in our actual lived experience, we operate as though we see clearly through the veil, convinced of our place in the hierarchy, confident in the righteousness of existing systems that benefit us or harm us. We construct elaborate justifications for inequality, believing them rational and inevitable rather than contingent outcomes of our fortunate or unfortunate positions. The veil of ignorance persists as a troubling mirror because it reveals how much of our moral reasoning is actually self-serving rationalization, and how easily we forget that the certainties we feel about justice and desert are largely illusions born from knowing exactly where we stand. Imagine a container divided in half by a wall, with a tiny door that can be opened and closed instantaneously. On one side, fast-moving gas molecules collide chaotically with the walls, generating heat. On the other side, slower molecules drift more languidly through their space. Now imagine a microscopic being, a demon as physicist James Clerk Maxwell described it, stationed at the door with perfect information about every approaching molecule. This demon possesses the ability to observe whether each molecule moves quickly or slowly, and with supernatural reflexes, it opens and closes the door to allow only the fast molecules through to one side and only the slow molecules to the other. Over time, the demon has created a separation that should be impossible according to the second law of thermodynamics. One side grows hotter while the other grows colder, and entropy decreases in the isolated system. Energy has been organized without any external work being performed. This appears to violate the fundamental law that disorder in a closed system must always increase. The mechanism at work here reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of information, observation, and the universe itself. The demon represents a kind of perfect knowledge, a complete awareness that allows manipulation of reality in ways that seem to contradict physical law. Yet the demon cannot actually exist because gathering information requires energy, and the thermodynamic cost of storing and erasing that information precisely cancels out any energy gained from the separation. What haunts this thought experiment is how it exposes the intimate connection between knowledge and entropy, between what we can observe and what the universe permits. It suggests that information is not immaterial or abstract, but rather deeply woven into the fabric of physical reality, subject to the same constraints as matter and energy themselves. Consider the peculiar position of consciousness contemplating its own cessation, a phenomenon so universal yet so deeply unsettling that we have constructed entire civilizations around the avoidance of thinking about it clearly. Picture yourself lying awake at 3 a.m, suddenly seized by the realization that one day, at some unknown moment, everything you are will simply stop existing, that the continuous stream of your subjective experience, the only thing you have ever directly known, will terminate absolutely and permanently, leaving behind only absence where your thoughts and perceptions once flowed. This is not a new fear, nor is it the product of modern anxieties, yet its intensity seems to intensify the more rationally we contemplate it, because the mechanism underlying this terror operates on a fundamental level of our consciousness that resists logical dissolution. The terror functions precisely because death is both completely inevitable and completely incomprehensible to a living mind, existing in a paradoxical space where we know it absolutely will occur, yet cannot genuinely imagine what non-existence actually feels like from the inside. We try to reason ourselves out of this fear by noting that we did not suffer during the billions of years before we were born, that unconsciousness holds no terror once we are in it. Yet these rational arguments scatter like morning mist when we lie in darkness and feel the solidity of our existence confronting its own ultimate fragility. What makes this terror persist so insidiously is that we have become extraordinarily skilled at not thinking about it directly, filling our days with distraction and purpose, creating meaning through work and relationships and projects that we somehow simultaneously know will not matter once we are gone. Yet this very avoidance ensures that when the thought does surface, it arrives with full force, undiluted by habituation, reminding us that beneath all. Consider the landscape of human achievement in the realm of artificial intelligence and notice something peculiar and deeply unsettling about what we have managed to accomplish. We have created machines that can defeat the greatest chess champions in the world, that can diagnose diseases from medical imaging with accuracy that rivals seasoned physicians, that can translate between languages and generate coherent text on virtually any topic with startling sophistication. Yet these same machines struggle with tasks that any child can perform without conscious effort, picking up a small object from a table, recognizing a face in a crowded room, walking across uneven terrain, or understanding the emotional subtext of a casual conversation. This is Moravec's paradox, named after computer scientist Hans Moravec, who observed that the difficulty of artificial intelligence problems is inversely related to their difficulty for humans. The reason for this counterintuitive pattern lies in the nature of human evolution and cognition. The skills we consider easy, visual recognition, motor coordination, social understanding, are actually the products of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary refinement encoded deeply into our neural architecture and operating largely beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The problems we find challenging, like playing chess or solving mathematical equations, are relatively recent inventions in evolutionary terms, emerging only within the last few thousand years, and they rely on conscious, deliberate reasoning processes that we can articulate and teach to machines. When we program a computer to play chess, we are translating explicit rules and strategies into code, which is straightforward. But when we try to teach a machine to recognize a chair, we must somehow encode the infinite variations of what constitutes a chair across different angles, lighting conditions, materials, and sizes, something our brains do. Imagine the universe as we understand it, stretching infinitely across space and time, governed by the inescapable laws of thermodynamics that ensure every system tends toward greater disorder and entropy. The heat death of the universe represents the ultimate end state of all existence, a moment billions of years in the future when every star has burned out, every black hole has evaporated through Hawking radiation, and all matter has decayed into its most fundamental particles scattered across an incomprehensibly vast and cold expanse. In this final state, no energy gradients remain, no temperatures differ between any two regions of space, and therefore no work can be performed, no processes can occur, and no life or consciousness of any kind could possibly exist or persist. The thought experiment forces us to confront the mathematical certainty that entropy, the measure of disorder in the universe, only increases over time according to the second law of thermodynamics, meaning that eventually all usable energy will be exhausted and the universe will reach a state of perfect equilibrium and absolute cold. What makes this concept philosophically terrifying is not merely the distant timeline of its occurrence, but rather the existential implications it carries about the fundamental meaninglessness of all effort, all creation, and all consciousness within a cosmos that is arithmetically guaranteed to end in total stillness and darkness. We continue to build civilizations, create art, conduct scientific research, and pursue goals as though our efforts matter and persist beyond ourselves. Yet we simultaneously accept the theoretical reality that every achievement will eventually be erased, every record will be lost, every monument will be reduced to scattered atoms in the void. Imagine that the legendary hero Theseus possessed a great axe, an instrument so integral to his identity that it became synonymous with his very existence. And suppose that this axe required maintenance over many years, requiring the gradual replacement of its handle due to wear and tear, and then eventually the replacement of its blade as well. until after decades of careful restoration, not a single original component remained from the tool that Theseus first wielded in his youth. Yet the axe continued to function perfectly and was still referred to as Theseus's axe by all who knew of it. Now imagine further that a collector discovered all the original discarded parts that had been removed over the centuries and carefully reassembled them into a fully functional axe, creating two artifacts that both claim legitimate status as the authentic Theseus's axe, one composed entirely of replacement parts maintained in continuous use, and one composed entirely of the original components brought together once more. This paradox forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question about the nature of identity itself, for we cannot logically determine which axe, if either, truly deserves the title of authenticity, as the continuously maintained version has persistence and unbroken continuity on its side, while the reassembled version possesses material originality and historical legitimacy. The psychological mechanism at work here taps into our fundamental assumption that objects possess some essential, unchanging nature that defines them across time. Yet experience reveals that this assumption crumbles under scrutiny, for we upgrade our vehicles and bodies, replace their cells, and rebuild our homes room by room, yet we maintain the conviction that these things remain the same entities we originally acquired. Imagine yourself waking up one morning and proceeding through your daily routine with perfect normalcy. You shower, you dress, you commute to work, you sit in meetings, you respond to emails, you return home, you eat dinner, you sleep, and then you wake to repeat the entire sequence again tomorrow and the day after that until decades have passed, and your life has simply dissolved into an endless succession of identical moments, and then you pause and ask yourself a single question that shatters everything. Why am I actually doing any of this? This is the confrontation with the absurd as conceived by Albert Camus, the moment when human consciousness collides with a universe that offers no inherent meaning, no grand narrative, and no satisfying answer to our desperate questions about purpose and significance. We are creatures obsessed with finding meaning in a cosmos that cannot provide it, beings who desperately seek reasons and patterns in a world that operates according to indifference rather than intention. Camus observed that we construct entire lives around goals that, upon examination, reveal themselves to be fundamentally arbitrary. We work toward promotions in hierarchies we did not design, we accumulate possessions we do not truly need, we perform social roles that feel increasingly hollow as we age, and we participate in systems whose ultimate purpose remains obscure even to those who created them. The psychological mechanism underlying this persistent condition is our remarkable capacity for self-deception and distraction, our ability to suppress the recognition of meaninglessness through constant activity, social validation, and the acceptance of inherited scripts about what life should contain. We have normalized the absurd so completely that questioning it appears irrational, yet it persists not because it has been resolved or explained away, but because we have collectively agreed to ignore it, to fill the void with routine and wry. Imagine you are about to be born into a society, but you do not yet know who you will become. You do not know your race, your gender, your economic class, your intelligence, your health, or your family circumstances. You exist in what the philosopher John Rawls called the veil of ignorance, a state of radical uncertainty about your own future position in the world. From behind this veil, you are asked to design the rules of society, knowing only that you will have to live under whatever system you create. This thought experiment forces us to confront a deeply unsettling question about the justice and fairness of the societies we actually inhabit. Consider how this perspective transforms our thinking about wealth inequality, social hierarchy, and systemic advantage. If you knew you might be born as anyone in your society, would you accept a system where some people have vastly more than others? Would you tolerate discrimination? Would you allow certain groups to suffer while others prosper? The mechanism at work here is profound and disorienting. By removing our knowledge of our own position, the thought experiment strips away the self-interest that usually guides our moral reasoning. We cannot simply advocate for policies that benefit people like us because we do not yet know who we are. This creates a unique form of moral clarity, yet also a kind of dizzying vertigo when we apply it to real societies. We live every day with full knowledge of our position, using that knowledge to justify the existing order. We tell ourselves that inequality reflects merit, that our advantages are earned, that the poor deserve their poverty. The original position asks us to question whether we would agree to such a system if we were not already winners in it. What becomes terrifying is recognizing that most of us, comfortable in our current positions, would likely never design the world exactly as it is if we did not already know we would occupy a privileged P. Imagine yourself in a coffin, 6 feet beneath the earth, in absolute darkness, with only a few hours of oxygen remaining and no way to signal for help from below the surface. This scenario, while grotesque, forces us to confront a peculiar philosophical problem about the nature of identity and survival that has haunted human consciousness for centuries. The buried alive dilemma asks us to consider whether a person who is rescued after being entombed would be the same person who was buried, given that during their entombment they experienced a form of death, or at least a state so close to death that the distinction becomes philosophically irrelevant. During those hours in darkness, your consciousness experiences a kind of suspension, a state between life and whatever lies beyond, and when you emerge, can you truly claim continuity with the person who entered that coffin? The psychological mechanism that makes this thought experiment so disturbing operates on our deepest fear of oblivion, combined with our intuitive understanding that conscious experience is what makes us who we are. When that experience is interrupted by a near-death state, we lose the continuous thread of memory and sensation that normally binds our identity together across time. Yet somehow, despite the logical coherence of this threat to our identity, we persist in believing that rescue equals salvation, that being pulled from the ground means we have survived intact. This normalization of false continuity reveals how desperately we cling to the illusion that our identity is robust and continuous, even when our own philosophies suggest it is fragile and contingent upon the unbroken stream of conscious experience that we so easily lose each night in sleep and almost lost forever in the coffin. Imagine a world so perfectly optimized for human flourishing that every single person experiences a life worth living, filled with genuine happiness, meaningful relationships, and purposeful work. Now imagine that this world contains 1 billion people, each living a deeply satisfying existence with rich emotional experiences and profound connections to others. Most of us would agree this represents an ideal state of affairs, a civilization worth celebrating and preserving. But now consider an alternative scenario where instead of 1 billion people living excellent lives, we have 10 billion people, each experiencing lives that are slightly less wonderful than the first scenario, yet still containing enough genuine well-being and satisfaction to make existence preferable to non-existence. According to the logic of total utilitarianism, a system that seeks to maximize overall happiness and well-being across all conscious beings, this second world with 10 billion moderately happy people would actually be morally superior to the first world, because it contains more total happiness, more total satisfaction spread across more lives. We can push this logic further into increasingly disturbing territory. What if we had 100 billion people, each living lives barely worth living, experiencing minimal happiness, perhaps just slightly above the threshold of indifference between existence and non-existence, yet still technically containing more aggregate well-being than the smaller populations before it? According to this utilitarian calculus, we should endorse and actively work toward creating such a world, populating it as densely as possible with lives that possess only the thinnest margin of positive experience. This is the repugnant conclusion, and it reveals a fundamental tension within how we think about ethics, population, and human value that persists in our moral reasoning despite its apparent absurdity. Imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, each one occupied by a guest, extending endlessly in both directions down an impossibly long corridor, a place where every single room contains a person, and there is not a single vacancy to be found anywhere within this boundless establishment. Now imagine that a new guest arrives at the front desk seeking shelter for the night, and the manager, rather than turning them away, simply asks the current guest in room 1 to move to room 2, the guest in room 2 to move to room 3, and every single guest to shift one room down the line in an endless cascade of relocations that somehow accommodates the newcomer in the now vacant first room. This is the Infinite Hotel Paradox, first articulated by mathematician David Hilbert, and it presents us with a scenario that reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of infinity itself and our inability to truly comprehend it through conventional logic. The paradox becomes even more troubling when we consider that infinitely many new guests could arrive simultaneously, and the manager could respond by asking each current guest to move to a room number double their present location, shifting occupant 1 to room 2, occupant 2 to room 4, occupant 3 to room 6, leaving all the odd-numbered rooms vacant and ready to accommodate an infinite number of newcomers all at once. What makes this thought experiment genuinely terrifying is not the mathematical resolution itself, but rather what it implies about the fundamental nature of infinity and quantity, suggesting that an infinite set can be made to contain another infinite set without growing any larger, that you can remove infinite quantities from infinity and still possess infinity, and that our intuitive understanding of size, space, and completeness breaks down entirely at the scale of the infinite. Imagine sitting across from someone you love, watching their face as they describe profound pain, watching their eyes water and their voice crack, and in that moment a peculiar thought emerges. You cannot actually know if they truly feel anything at all. You perceive their behavior, their words, their physical responses, but the subjective experience of their consciousness remains forever locked away behind the barrier of your own mind, inaccessible and ultimately unknowable. This is the problem of other minds, and it suggests something deeply unsettling about the human condition. The only consciousness you can ever truly be certain exists is your own. You know with absolute certainty that you experience the world, that you have sensations and emotions and thoughts, but when you observe other people, you only ever witness their external actions and expressions, never the inner landscape of their subjective experience. From a purely logical standpoint, you infer that others have minds similar to yours because they behave as though they do, because they claim to have experiences, because their physical structures resemble yours, but these are all inferences, educated guesses built upon patterns and analogies. The mechanism underlying this problem is the asymmetry of consciousness itself. Consciousness is private, inherently subjective, observable only from within, and therefore you can never access another person's inner experience the way you access your own. Despite this logical foundation for skepticism, humans have normalized an extraordinary leap of faith across this epistemological gap, operating daily as though other minds exist with certainty equivalent to our own, treating the feelings and experiences of others as real and morally significant without ever being able to prove they truly exist. Imagine that medical science has advanced to the point where brain transplantation is possible, and you find yourself in a peculiar scenario. You are told that your brain will be removed from your body and transplanted into a new, healthy body, while your original body will receive someone else's brain. The procedure is painless, instantaneous, and medically perfect. The question that emerges from this thought experiment is deceptively simple yet philosophically devastating. After the surgery is complete, who will you be? Will you wake up in the new body, experiencing the continuity of your consciousness as if nothing has changed except your physical form? Or will your consciousness remain with your original body, now inhabited by someone else's mind, leaving you trapped and helpless while a stranger controls the body you've inhabited your entire life? The puzzle forces us to confront what philosophers call the personal identity problem, that gnawing uncertainty about what actually makes you fundamentally you. Most people intuitively believe they would wake up in the new body, that consciousness follows the brain as a kind of immaterial passenger traveling in biological cargo. Yet this intuition rests on an assumption we've never truly verified, that consciousness is a locatable thing that can be transported from vessel to vessel like water poured between containers. The terrifying reality is that we have no empirical way to know where consciousness actually resides or how it behaves when physical substrates change. We cannot step outside our own experience to verify whether continuous subjective awareness genuinely persists, or whether each moment simply feels continuous while you are actually being replaced by indistinguishable copies. This uncertainty persists not because we lack enough information, but because consciousness itself remains fundamentally mysterious to science, observable only from the inside by the very thing we're trying. Imagine a society where one individual, through some biological or neurological quirk, experiences pleasure and satisfaction far more intensely than any other human being, deriving exponentially greater happiness from resources, experiences, and opportunities than ordinary people could ever achieve. The utility monster, as philosophers call this thought experiment, presents us with a profound moral dilemma that challenges the very foundations of utilitarian ethics. In this scenario, if we accept the utilitarian principle that society should maximize overall happiness and well-being, then logically we would be morally obligated to transfer virtually all of society's resources to this single individual, because even the smallest gift to them would produce more total happiness than distributing those same resources among thousands of ordinary people. The monster's capacity for joy is simply incomparable, making their satisfaction infinitely more valuable from a strictly utilitarian calculus. The philosophical mechanism driving this troubling conclusion operates through pure mathematical logic applied to human welfare. Utilitarianism, the ethical framework suggesting that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they produce unhappiness, contains no built-in protection against this scenario. If happiness is the only thing that matters morally, and if one being can experience vastly more happiness than others, then preventing that being from receiving maximum resources would effectively reduce total utility, making it immoral to distribute wealth more equally. This creates an unsettling reductio ad absurdum that reveals a potential fundamental flaw in utilitarian reasoning itself. What haunts us about this thought experiment is not merely its logical conclusion, but how it mirrors certain aspects of contemporary society that we have unconsciously normalized. Imagine a race between the swift warrior Achilles and a slow tortoise, where the tortoise is given a head start of some distance ahead on the track. At first, this seems like an obvious victory for Achilles, whose speed far exceeds that of his shelled competitor, yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno proposed a mathematical paradox that suggests something peculiar about the nature of motion and distance itself. Before Achilles can catch the tortoise, he must first reach the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he arrives at that location, the tortoise has already moved forward some additional distance, however small. Achilles must then close this new gap, but again the tortoise continues forward, creating yet another gap to overcome. This process repeats infinitely, with each interval becoming progressively smaller but never quite reaching zero, leading to the unsettling conclusion that Achilles can never actually catch the tortoise despite his obvious physical superiority. The paradox functions through the mechanism of infinite divisibility, where any finite distance can theoretically be broken into an infinite number of smaller segments, and our intuition rebels against the idea that traversing infinitely many intervals should take infinite time. What makes this thought experiment philosophically terrifying is not merely its mathematical puzzle, but rather what it reveals about the potential disconnect between our physical reality and the nature of space, time, and motion as we understand them mathematically. We have resolved this paradox through calculus and our understanding of infinite series, yet the fundamental question it raises about continuous motion and the composition of distance persists in our collective consciousness. Imagine that somewhere in the vast cosmos, there exists a planet virtually identical to our own, orbiting a star that looks exactly like our sun, populated by beings who look exactly like us and speak languages that sound exactly like ours. This planet, called Twin Earth, is so perfectly mirrored that every atom, every molecule, every arrangement of matter appears to correspond precisely with its counterpart on our world. On Twin Earth, there is a substance that fills the oceans and falls as rain, that humans drink and bathe in, that behaves in every observable way exactly like water on Earth. Yet there is one crucial difference. While our water is H2O, the substance on Twin Earth is a completely different chemical compound, perhaps XYZ, some other molecular structure that happens to produce identical physical effects. Now consider a thought that should trouble you deeply as you drift towards sleep. When you point to a glass of water on Twin Earth and use the word water, and when your Twin Earth counterpart points to a glass of their substance and uses the same word water, are you both referring to the same thing? The experiment reveals something unsettling about the nature of meaning itself. The traditional view suggests that the meaning of a word exists purely in the mind, that if two people have identical thoughts about water, then they mean the same thing by the word. Yet this experiment demonstrates that meaning might not be entirely internal to the mind at all. Your word water refers to H2O precisely because that is what water actually is in your environment, regardless of what you think about it. Your Twin Earth counterpart's word water refers to XYZ because that is what they have interacted with causally throughout their existence. This implies something deeply unsettling. Your thoughts alone cannot determine what your words mean. Imagine you are walking past a shallow pond on your way to an important meeting, and you notice a small child drowning in the water, struggling and gasping for breath, clearly moments away from death. You are the only person present, and you alone have the ability to wade into the water and pull the child to safety, though doing so would ruin your expensive clothes and cause you to arrive late to your meeting, disappointing colleagues who are counting on you. The choice seems obvious. Any rational person would immediately enter the water and save the child's life, accepting the minor inconvenience of ruined clothing and a delayed arrival. This scenario, presented by philosopher Peter Singer, reveals a profound inconsistency in how we prioritize our moral obligations and allocate our resources. The mechanism behind this thought experiment exposes the artificial boundaries we construct between direct and indirect responsibility, between what happens in front of us and what happens far away. When confronted with immediate, visible suffering that we can personally prevent, our moral intuitions compel us to act. Yet when presented with the statistical reality that thousands of children die daily from preventable poverty and disease in distant countries, we experience far less moral urgency despite having precisely the same power to prevent their deaths through charitable donations. We possess the capacity to save lives through modest financial sacrifice, yet we distinguish sharply between the drowning child and the distant child, treating one as an undeniable moral obligation and the other as a matter of personal preference. This inconsistency persists not because we lack logical reasoning capacity, but because our moral emotions evolved in intimate communities where we encountered suffering face to face, and our rational minds have never fully corrected this ancient bias, allowing us to live comfortably with contradictions that would be impossible. Imagine a person born blind from birth who has spent their entire life learning about the world exclusively through touch, developing an intricate and complete understanding of shapes through their fingertips alone, knowing a cube and a sphere not by sight, but through the careful exploration of their edges and surfaces. Now imagine that this person suddenly gains the ability to see, their eyes opening to light and color and visual information for the very first time in their existence. The philosophical question that emerges from this scenario, posed by William Molyneux in the 17th century, asks whether this newly sighted person would be able to recognize those familiar shapes through vision alone without touching them first. Would their lifetime of tactile knowledge translate seamlessly into visual recognition, or would they stand confused before objects they intellectually understood but had never experienced through sight? The mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something profound about the nature of human perception and knowledge itself, suggesting that our different sensory modes may not be as interconnected as we assume, that the knowledge we gain through one sense might be fundamentally incompatible with another, and that understanding something intellectually does not necessarily grant us the ability to recognize it through a different perceptual channel. What makes Molyneux's problem so quietly terrifying is that it forces us to confront the possibility that our unified sense of reality might actually be a careful construction, a translation between separate sensory languages that our brain performs so seamlessly we never notice the gaps. We proceed through life assuming that a cube is a cube regardless of how we perceive it. Yet this ancient puzzle suggests that perception might be more fractured and disconnected than we realize, that knowledge gained in one sensory mode requires its own separate education. And imagine two suspects arrested for a crime and placed in separate interrogation rooms with no ability to communicate with one another, forced to make a decision that will determine their fate based entirely on what they believe the other person will do. Each prisoner is offered the same deal. If you betray your partner and they remain silent, you walk free while they receive 10 years in prison. But if you both remain silent, you each serve only 1 year, and if you both betray each other, you both serve 5 years. The logical structure of this scenario creates an impossible paradox where the individually rational choice produces a collectively irrational outcome. Because each prisoner, reasoning from pure self-interest, will inevitably choose to betray the other person regardless of what the other person does, since betrayal either results in freedom or reduces their sentence from 10 years to 5, while cooperation either results in freedom or increases their sentence from 1 year to 5. This mathematical certainty of mutual defection occurs even though both prisoners would be better off cooperating, revealing a fundamental truth about human decision-making when trust is absent and self-preservation is the only guaranteed motive. The prisoner's dilemma persists as a model for understanding countless real-world scenarios from international arms races to climate negotiations to business competition, where nations and corporations find themselves trapped in cycles of escalation and exploitation that harm everyone involved, yet where the fear of unilateral disadvantage makes defection the only psychologically tolerable choice. We continue to inhabit this dilemma across our economies, our diplomacy, and our personal relationships, knowing full well that cooperation would benefit all parties, yet unable to escape the gravitational pull of rational self-interest that compels us toward mutual destruction, as if we are prisoners locked in separa. Imagine that you are put to sleep on a Sunday evening, and while you are unconscious, a fair coin is flipped in secret by researchers who will never tell you the outcome. If the coin lands on heads, you will be awakened on Monday, have a brief conversation, be given a drug to erase your memory of this awakening, and then return to sleep until Wednesday morning when you finally wake for good. If the coin lands on tails, you will be awakened on Monday, have that same conversation, receive that same memory-erasing drug, be put back to sleep, awakened again on Tuesday with no memory of Monday, have another identical conversation, receive another dose of the drug, and then sleep until Wednesday when you wake permanently. The question that haunts this scenario is deceptively simple. When you wake up during this experiment, uncertain whether it is Monday or Tuesday, what should you rationally believe about the probability that the coin landed on heads? Your initial intuition might be that it should be 1/2, since a coin flip is a fair 50-50 proposition, and nothing about your subjective experience can change an objective fact about what already happened before you fell asleep. Yet another perspective suggests that from the first-person point of view, you should reason differently, because if the coin landed on tails, you would wake up twice, while if it landed on heads, you would wake up only once, meaning there is a greater statistical likelihood that any given awakening belongs to a tails scenario. This puzzle reveals something profoundly unsettling about the nature of probability, identity, and how we assign credence to propositions about an external world that we cannot directly access. The Sleeping Beauty problem persists as a genuine philosophical disagreement among logicians and epistemologists who cannot seem to agree on which framework for rational belief is actually correct, demonstrating that even our most fundamental tools for. Imagine a neurosurgeon performing a procedure to sever the corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the left and right hemispheres of your brain, perhaps to treat severe epilepsy. The surgery is successful, and you recover, but something profoundly strange has occurred, something that Derek Parfit asks us to contemplate with the utmost seriousness. After the surgery, each hemisphere of your brain can process information independently, can form separate beliefs and desires, can even seem to have its own stream of consciousness. If information is presented only to your left visual field, only your right hemisphere perceives it. If a command is given only to your right hemisphere, only that side responds. You have become, in effect, two separate minds housed within one body. The question that haunts this scenario, the one that keeps philosophers awake at night, is deceptively simple. Which one is you? Before the surgery, you were unambiguously singular, a unified conscious entity with one perspective on the world. But now, after the severing of your hemispheres, there exist two streams of consciousness where there was once only one. Each hemisphere has equal claim to continuity with your pre-surgery self. Each can remember your life, your memories, your personality traits. Each has your brain tissue, your neural patterns, your history. Yet they cannot both fully be you in the way you were you before, because they are not unified with each other. This scenario exposes something unsettling about personal identity itself, revealing that our intuitive sense of being a singular, continuous self may be an illusion we maintain despite compelling evidence to the contrary. We navigate the world assuming our identity is a fundamental, indivisible fact, a given truth about our existence. Yet Parfit's divided mind suggests that identity might be nothing more than a useful fiction we construct. Imagine that you and another person each have a box, and inside your box is something you call a beetle, though neither of you can ever see inside the other's box, only your own. You know what your beetle looks like, its color, its shape, the way it moves, but the other person knows only their own beetle through the same private experience. When you both talk about your beetles, you use the same word beetle, and you seem to understand each other perfectly, yet you have no way of knowing if the thing in your box resembles the thing in theirs at all. Perhaps your beetle is bright red and has 6 legs, while the other person's beetle is purple with wings, or perhaps it is not even a beetle but something entirely different, something that cannot be properly named. The two of you have built an entire language around these creatures, referring to them in sentences and discussions, yet the fundamental nature of each beetle remains locked away in private, inaccessible consciousness. This thought experiment, drawn from Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical work, highlights a troubling gap in human communication and understanding. We assume that when we name something and discuss it with others, we are referring to the same objective thing, yet the subjective quality of our experience, what philosophers call qualia, remains forever sealed behind the wall of individual consciousness. No amount of description can truly transfer the redness of red or the painfulness of pain from one mind to another. We have learned to navigate this problem by pretending it does not exist, by building social contracts that treat our private experiences as though they were shared and comparable. Yet the uncertainty persists at the foundation of all human connection and language itself. Imagine two scenarios placed before you, each demanding a choice between suffering and morality. In the first scenario, a single person experiences a dust speck in their eye for a duration of 10 years. The speck causes mild discomfort, a persistent irritation that never quite becomes unbearable, never quite fades away, but simply remains as a constant low-level annoyance throughout the entirety of a decade. In the second scenario, billions upon billions of people each experience a barely perceptible amount of suffering, so minuscule that it hardly registers as pain at all, perhaps just the lightest brush of discomfort that lasts only a few seconds before vanishing completely. The philosophical paradox emerges when we ask, which scenario is worse? When we multiply an infinitesimal amount of suffering across an astronomical number of people, does it eventually exceed the concentrated suffering of one individual, no matter how prolonged? The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so deeply unsettling operates on the intersection of mathematics and human intuition. Our minds rebel against the conclusion that vast multiplicities of trivial harms could outweigh singular, concentrated suffering, yet the logic seems inexorable. If one dust speck in one eye for 10 years causes measurable harm, then surely a trillion dust specks experienced by a trillion people, each lasting seconds, accumulates to something greater. Yet something in our moral fabric recoils from this utilitarian calculation, suggesting that perhaps our ethical systems cannot be reduced to simple arithmetic, that human dignity and concentrated suffering possess qualities that resist mathematical aggregation in ways we do not fully comprehend. This tension persists in our reasoning despite having no logical resolution, remaining a quiet philosophical vertigo that accompanies anyone attempting to construct a coherent moral framework. Consider the moment when you fall into deep, dreamless sleep, that state where consciousness simply ceases to exist, where there is no experience, no awareness, no sense of time passing at all. Now imagine that one night you fall asleep and never wake up. Your body might continue to exist for a moment, but you, the experiencing subject, are gone entirely. There is no darkness, no confusion, no sense of time stretching endlessly before you, because there is no you anymore to experience anything. This is the condition of eternal oblivion, and it is the fate that awaits every conscious being on earth. The terrifying aspect of this thought experiment lies not in suffering or pain, but in the absolute cessation of existence, the permanent end of all experience without warning or transition. What makes this concept so psychologically disarming is that we already experience brief versions of it every single night, yet we have trained ourselves not to think deeply about what it actually means. When you fall asleep without dreaming, you lose consciousness completely. The time between closing your eyes and opening them again feels instantaneous from your perspective, even if 8 hours have genuinely passed in the external world. This is a perfect rehearsal for death, a nightly demonstration of what it feels like to not exist, and yet we treat sleep as utterly ordinary, something unremarkable and expected. We have normalized the regular practice of our own non-existence, making it comfortable and desirable, even though the mechanism is identical to what we fear most about death itself. The logical contradiction at the heart of eternal oblivion is that we cannot actually suffer it or be bothered by it, because suffering requires consciousness, and oblivion is precisely the absence of consciousness. Imagine you are presented with a choice that seems impossible to make, a choice that forces you to confront the deepest inconsistencies in how you value suffering and existence itself. On one side of this terrible equation, a single person will be tortured intensely for 50 years, experiencing unrelenting pain, psychological anguish, and complete isolation throughout every moment of those decades. On the other side, a dust speck, invisibly small and imperceptible, will be placed in the eye of every person who has ever lived or will ever live, causing only the briefest moment of mild discomfort, lasting merely 5 seconds, and then disappearing forever with no lasting harm or memory of the incident. You must choose which outcome should occur, knowing that one must happen, and avoiding the choice is itself a choice. Most people, when first confronted with this thought experiment, recoil from accepting the torture of a single innocent person, yet they struggle to justify why the suffering of billions across all of human history should outweigh one person's 50 years of agony. The mechanism at work here reveals something profound about human moral intuition. We are far better equipped psychologically to comprehend and react to concentrated, vivid, intense suffering than we are to truly grasp the cumulative weight of distributed, diffuse harm affecting countless people. The tortured individual becomes real to us, their screams echo in our imagination, and we feel their pain viscerally, whereas billions of dust specks remain abstract numbers, statistics that fail to move us emotionally no matter how carefully we multiply them. This disparity persists despite our rational understanding that suffering is suffering, that pain in one consciousness matters just as much as pain in another, and that mathematics itself suggests the aggregate harm of trillions of brief discomforts must eventually exceed any finite period of torture. Imagine a donkey standing perfectly equidistant between two identical piles of hay, each equally appetizing, each equally distant, each offering the same nutritional value and satisfaction. The donkey is hungry, genuinely hungry, and yet it finds itself paralyzed in the space between these two options because there exists no rational basis for choosing one pile over the other. According to the medieval philosopher Jean Baradin's thought experiment, this donkey should starve to death, unable to make a decision when presented with two perfectly symmetrical choices, because reason alone cannot arbitrate between truly equivalent alternatives. The donkey would require some arbitrary preference, some irrational impulse or external factor to break the deadlock and compel it toward one direction or the other, yet in this perfectly symmetrical scenario, no such preference exists. The mechanism underlying this paradox reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of rational choice and decision-making itself. We assume that reason is sufficient to guide our actions, that logical deliberation naturally produces outcomes, yet Baradin's ass demonstrates that pure reason without any asymmetrical information, preference, or external circumstance simply cannot generate action. It exposes the possibility that rational thought alone is incomplete, that we require something beyond logic to navigate even the simplest bifurcations in our path. And yet, despite understanding this philosophical trap, we encounter versions of it throughout our actual lives, finding ourselves genuinely frozen before choices that logic cannot resolve, whether deciding between two job offers with identical salaries, two potential partners who seem equally compatible, or two life paths that offer the same objective outcomes. Imagine you're standing at one end of a room and you wish to walk to the opposite wall, a distance of perhaps 30 feet, a journey that seems straightforward and accomplished thousands of times each day by countless people. According to Zeno's dichotomy paradox, formulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around 2,500 years ago, you face an impossible task that should prevent you from ever reaching your destination. To travel the full distance, you must first travel half that distance, which means covering 15 feet. But before you can complete those 15 feet, you must travel half of that distance, meaning 7.5 feet. Before covering those 7.5 feet, you must travel half again, meaning 3.75 feet. This process of infinite subdivision continues forever, with each step requiring you to first complete an infinite number of preceding steps, each smaller than the last but never truly disappearing into nothingness. The paradox suggests that motion itself is logically impossible because traversing an infinite number of distances, no matter how small, should require infinite time. Yet here you stand, aware of this paradox, and you walk across the room effortlessly, arriving at the wall in mere seconds, defying what seems to be an airtight logical argument. The mechanism behind this philosophical puzzle rests on the distinction between mathematical infinity and physical reality, between the infinite divisibility of space in abstract thought and the way actual movement unfolds in time. We have normalized this paradox by accepting that while space can be infinitely divided in mathematics, the actual completion of motion does not require traversing each infinitesimal segment with conscious attention or individual effort, and that the sum of an infinite series can indeed produce a finite result. Imagine you are standing in an open field on a warm afternoon, and you notice a grasshopper perched on a blade of grass nearby. You watch it for a moment, observing its stillness, its patience, the way its legs are positioned for an immediate leap. Now consider this: if you were to approach that grasshopper slowly and deliberately, it would wait until you came within a certain distance before jumping away. It does not flee preemptively, does not flee when you are far away, but only when you cross some invisible threshold of proximity. This threshold, this precise moment of decision, is the grasshopper problem, and it reveals something deeply unsettling about the nature of boundaries, continuity, and our inability to locate exact moments of change in the world. The grasshopper does not know exactly when to jump, and neither do we know exactly when it will. There is no single moment, no definable point, where the distance changes from safe to dangerous. Each millimeter you move closer is individually imperceptible, yet somewhere in that gradual approach lies a transformation from security to threat. This is the Sorites Paradox applied to living behavior, a phenomenon that haunts not just philosophy, but our entire perception of reality. We cannot identify the exact grain of sand that turns a heap into a non-heap, the exact hair that, when removed, transforms a bald person into someone with hair, and we cannot identify the exact moment when the grasshopper decides it must escape. This problem persists in our minds because we have built our logic around discrete categories and sharp boundaries, yet the natural world operates in continuous gradients and smooth transitions. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that we scarcely notice it anymore, moving through life accepting that thresholds exist somewhere, even though we cannot locate them, even though our most careful analysis suggests they may not exist at all. Imagine a lion that has somehow acquired the ability to speak your language perfectly, with complete fluency and grammatical precision, and one day this lion approaches you and says, "I am suffering terribly, my joints ache, my hunger is unbearable, and I feel profoundly lonely." You would understand every word, comprehend the semantic content entirely, yet something in you would resist the conclusion that you truly understand what the lion is experiencing, because you cannot fathom what suffering means from inside a lion's body, from within the architecture of its alien consciousness and radically different form of existence. This is the essence of Wittgenstein's philosophical puzzle about the fundamental limits of language and empathy. The Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein posed this thought experiment to illustrate a devastating truth about human communication. That language, despite its remarkable power, contains an unbridgeable gap between the speaker and the listener when their forms of life are too different. Even if the lion could articulate its inner states with perfect clarity, even if it possessed all the right words and all the right combinations, something essential would remain forever locked away from you, inaccessible and untranslatable. The mechanism at work here is the dependence of meaning on what Wittgenstein called form of life, the lived context of embodied experience that gives language its significance. We learn what words mean not through abstract definitions, but through participation in shared activities, shared sensations, shared ways of navigating the world. To understand what pain means, you had to experience pain yourself. To comprehend what hunger means, you had to feel hunger. But you have never been a lion, never moved through the world with 4 legs and predatory instincts, never seen the savannah through a lion's eyes or felt the sun on a lion's mane. Imagine a sealed box containing a living cat, a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison gas, all arranged in such a way that if the atom decays and triggers the counter, the poison is released and the cat dies, but if the atom does not decay, the cat remains alive. Once the box is sealed and left undisturbed, quantum mechanics tells us that the atom exists in a superposition of both decayed and not decayed states simultaneously, existing in both conditions at once until someone opens the box and observes the outcome. This means that according to the strict interpretation of quantum theory, the cat inside must also exist in a superposition of both alive and dead at the same time, not merely unknown or uncertain, but genuinely occupying both states of existence in parallel, until the moment of observation collapses this superposition into one definite reality. The unsettling mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals how our classical intuitions about reality break down at quantum scales, and how the act of observation itself seems to play a role in determining which reality manifests, creating a bizarre entanglement between consciousness and the physical world. What makes this experiment so psychologically disturbing is not the paradox itself, which physicists have thoroughly debated and rationalized, but rather our reluctance to fully accept that this strange quantum behavior might scale up to our everyday world, even though we have compartmentalized it as purely a microscopic phenomenon, without acknowledging that the boundary between quantum and classical remains fundamentally unresolved and arbitrary. Perhaps the deepest insight is that Schrödinger himself proposed this thought experiment not to defend quantum superposition at macroscopic scales, but to demonstrate its absurdity. Yet nearly a century later, we still cannot definitively say where the boundary lies, or if such a boundary exists at all. Imagine waking up in a hospital bed, connected by tubes and medical equipment to an unconscious person lying beside you. A doctor enters and explains that this person is a famous violinist suffering from a rare kidney ailment, and you are the only person on Earth whose blood type matches theirs. The violinist will die without your kidney, and the doctor is asking whether you would consent to having your kidney surgically removed and transplanted into this stranger's body, knowing that you would recover fully, but would have to remain connected to this violinist for 9 months while their kidneys heal. This scenario, crafted by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson in 1971, presents a deceptively simple question that has become one of the most unsettling thought experiments in modern philosophy, because it forces us to confront something deeply disturbing about how we justify our claims to bodily autonomy and moral obligation. The experiment's power lies not in its realism, but in its clarity, stripping away the contextual noise that clouds our judgment in real moral situations and presenting us with an undeniable fact. Most people instinctively believe they have the right to refuse, even though their refusal means another human being will die. Thomson used this scenario to argue that even if a fetus has the right to life, that right does not obligate a pregnant woman to allow her body to be used as life support, a position that transformed abortion ethics by introducing the concept that bodily autonomy might trump another person's right to continued existence. Yet what makes this thought experiment genuinely terrifying is that it reveals how easily we can construct justifications for letting others die when their survival inconveniences us, and how readily we accept those justifications as moral truth rather than recognizing them as expressions of preference masquerading as principle. Imagine that you are about to undergo a medical procedure, and a scientist approaches you with a proposition that seems almost absurd in its specificity. Your body will be scanned at the molecular level with perfect precision, and then transported across the room through a process called teletransportation, where every atom of your being will be disassembled and reassembled in an identical configuration in a new location, with your original body destroyed in the process to prevent duplication. The scientist assures you that the procedure is completely safe, that the reassembled version of you will have all your memories, your personality, your consciousness exactly as it is now, and that from a physical standpoint, there will be no detectable difference between the you that enters the machine and the you that emerges from it on the other side of the room. The question that haunts us is this: would you step into that machine? And more importantly, when you wake up on the other side with all your memories intact, all your personality preserved, all your physical characteristics restored, would you truly be you, or would you be a copy of you while the original you experienced death? This is the Fission Problem, and it cuts to the very heart of personal identity and what we mean when we speak of the continuity of self. The terror emerges not from anything gruesome or physically harmful, but from the realization that our intuitions about identity contradict our rational understanding of what identity actually is. If we can replace every atom in your body over time through natural cellular processes and you remain yourself, then why would instantaneous replacement through teletransportation create a different person? Yet most of us feel viscerally that stepping into that machine would be a form of suicide, a creation of a duplicate while our consciousness perishes. Imagine a turkey on a farm, living day after day in a predictable routine, and each morning at 9 o'clock, the farmer arrives with food, and the turkey eats, and the turkey is satisfied. And this pattern repeats with such consistency that the turkey begins to form expectations about the world based entirely on accumulated experience. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the routine holds firm, and the turkey's confidence in the pattern grows stronger and more certain, until one morning arrives and the farmer does not bring food but instead brings an axe. And suddenly everything the turkey believed to be true about its reality shatters in an instant, because the turkey had confused the mere continuation of the past with a guarantee about the future. The philosophical mechanism at work here is what we call the problem of induction, the fundamental vulnerability in how we construct knowledge from repeated observations, the assumption that because something has happened consistently in the past, it must continue happening in the future, an assumption so deeply embedded in how we navigate existence that we rarely pause to question its validity. We wake each morning assuming our loved ones will remain alive because they were alive yesterday. We invest in retirement plans assuming the economic system sustaining them will persist. We take medicines expecting they will work today as they worked in clinical trials, and none of these assumptions are logically guaranteed. They are all vulnerable to the turkey's fate, the sudden rupture where everything we thought we understood collapses. What makes this thought experiment particularly haunting is that we cannot actually escape it. We cannot live as though nothing can be counted on. We must operate as though patterns will continue. Yet that very necessity blinds us to the fragility of our understanding, to how much of what we consider knowledge is merely uninterrupted luck masquerading as low. Imagine a crowded street in a city center during the middle of a busy afternoon, where dozens of people pass by one another every second, all moving in their own directions with their own destinations in mind. Now imagine that one person suddenly collapses on the sidewalk, their body going limp, their breathing shallow and uncertain. You would reasonably assume that with so many witnesses present, someone would immediately call for help, that concerned individuals would rush to their aid, that the sheer volume of people around would guarantee swift intervention and rescue. Yet what actually happens, with remarkable consistency across documented cases, is that almost no one moves, that minutes pass in silence, that the person remains untouched and unassisted despite being surrounded by dozens or even hundreds of potential rescuers. This phenomenon, known as the Bystander Effect, reveals something deeply unsettling about human behavior in collective situations, something that contradicts our intuitions about morality and compassion. The mechanism behind this effect operates through a subtle process of diffusion of responsibility, where each individual in a crowd unconsciously distributes the burden of action across all present parties, creating a perverse mathematics in which more people means less personal obligation. Additionally, observers tend to look toward others for cues about how to behave, creating a false sense of calm when everyone around them seems equally unmoved, a collective agreement of inaction that reinforces itself through mutual observation. What makes this phenomenon particularly terrifying is how it persists despite our explicit awareness of it, how we continue to be trapped by these psychological patterns even when we understand them intellectually, how the presence of others remains a more powerful force in determining our behavior than our own sense of moral duty or the desperate need of another human being before us. Imagine that God in the beginning was everything, infinite, omnipotent, and complete, but that God chose to explode into infinite pieces, scattering consciousness throughout the universe in the form of matter, energy, and ultimately human awareness. This is the premise explored in Blake Crouch's philosophical thought experiment, and it suggests that you, me, and every conscious being are literally fragments of the divine experiencing itself from countless perspectives simultaneously. The experiment forces us to consider that what we call God did not create the universe from outside it, but rather became the universe by willingly shattering into existence. Every atom, every thought, every moment of awareness would then be God exploring what it means to be limited, mortal, and separate. We would be God pretending to be human, fragments of divinity that have forgotten their original nature, trapped in an existence where we experience isolation, suffering, and the desperate search for meaning and connection. The psychological mechanism at work here is profoundly disorienting because it simultaneously answers and obliterates our deepest questions about existence. It transforms the problem of evil into something almost beautiful. Suffering becomes necessary, a consequence of God choosing to experience limitation. It makes our consciousness sacred yet paradoxically insignificant, as we are both everything and nothing simultaneously. The terror emerges not from logical inconsistency, but from the vertigo of contemplating what you would become if this were true, and more disturbingly, how you would never be able to prove it false. You could never distinguish between being a fragment of God that has forgotten itself and being merely human, yet this indistinguishability may be precisely the point, the final test of faith disguised as the deepest metaphysical uncertainty about your own existence. Imagine that a wealthy, eccentric billionaire approaches you with an unusual proposition, offering you $1 million simply for forming the sincere intention to drink a toxin tomorrow that will make you mildly ill for several hours, causing nothing more than intense nausea and discomfort, but no lasting harm or permanent damage to your body. The catch is that you must demonstrate your genuine intention to drink this toxin, and once the billionaire is satisfied that you truly intend to go through with it, they will deposit the money into your account immediately. However, there is a second catch, perhaps the most puzzling element of this thought experiment. You are allowed to change your mind at any moment, even after receiving the money, even after committing to the intention. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and face the actual toxin bottle sitting before you, no one will force you to drink it. You will be completely free to abandon your plan and keep the money anyway. So the question becomes elegantly simple yet deeply perplexing. Can you genuinely form the intention to drink the toxin knowing that you will have every opportunity and incentive to abandon that intention before actually consuming it? This puzzle reveals a profound tension between intention and rationality that sits at the heart of human decision-making. The problem is that you cannot rationally intend to do something you know you will rationally choose not to do when the moment arrives. Once you receive the money, drinking the toxin becomes pointless suffering with no benefit, making it irrational to actually drink it. Yet the billionaire can verify whether your intention is genuine through your behavior, your language, and your apparent commitment. And this creates an impossible logical knot that philosophers continue to unravel and debate decades after Gregory Kafka first proposed it. Imagine a neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, studying the nature of color through black and white books, monitors, and papers, acquiring every conceivable fact about color, wavelengths, neural responses, and the physics of light. Yet she has never actually experienced the color red herself, never felt the subjective sensation of seeing crimson across her vision, never known what the experience of color feels like from the inside. One day, Mary leaves her monochromatic chamber and sees a red rose for the first time, and in that moment she learns something entirely new, something that all her accumulated factual knowledge could never have provided, the raw qualitative experience of redness itself. This is the knowledge argument, a philosophical thought experiment that suggests something fundamental about the nature of consciousness and understanding that we tend to gloss over in our everyday existence. The mechanism at work here reveals a troubling gap in how we conceptualize knowledge itself, because Mary possessed complete objective information about color but lacked subjective experience. And this reveals that knowledge might be fundamentally divided into two separate categories that cannot be reduced to one another. The thought experiment suggests that physical facts alone, no matter how comprehensive, cannot fully capture the nature of conscious experience, that there exists a qualitative dimension to awareness that resists being converted into mere information, and this persists as a devastating challenge to our belief that everything about the mind can eventually be explained through neuroscience and physics. We have normalized the assumption that knowing facts and having experiences are ultimately the same thing, that understanding something completely means possessing all relevant information, yet the knowledge argument haunts this conviction by demonstrating that even perfect factual KN. Consider the moment when you truly contemplate your own non-existence, not as an abstract concept, but as an inevitable reality that will arrive without warning or farewell. Thomas Nagel's meditation on the void invites us to sit with the peculiar terror of understanding that one day, consciousness itself will simply cease, that the entire universe of your subjective experience will vanish as completely as if it had never occurred at all. Imagine lying in bed at night and allowing yourself to genuinely consider what it will be like when you no longer exist to consider anything, when there will be no experience of darkness or silence or peace, but rather the complete and utter absence of all experience whatsoever. The void represents not death as an event we might fear or mourn, but rather the infinite expanse of non-being that stretched before we were born and will stretch after we depart, a nothingness so total and comprehensive that it renders all our achievements and relationships and carefully constructed meanings fundamentally insignificant in cosmic terms. What makes this thought experiment particularly unsettling is the recognition that the void cannot truly be experienced or imagined in any genuine way, because experience itself requires consciousness, and the void is precisely the negation of that consciousness. We find ourselves trapped in an impossible cognitive position where we cannot actually conceive of what we most fundamentally dread, yet we understand with perfect clarity that this incomprehensible state awaits us inevitably. The terror persists not because we have encountered evidence of non-existence or because logic compels us toward despair, but because we are beings capable of recognizing our own finitude while simultaneously being incapable of making peace with it through reason alone. Consider the moment you wake from a vivid dream, disoriented and uncertain whether the dream was real or your current waking state is the dream. And in that suspended confusion, you realize you have no empirical way to distinguish between them. No external evidence that could prove your waking world is not simply another layer of illusion constructed by your own mind. And as this realization settles into your consciousness, you begin to wonder whether anyone else actually exists outside of your perception of them, whether the people you love and interact with daily are truly independent beings with their own inner lives or merely sophisticated projections of your own consciousness, characters in an elaborate theater staged entirely within your mind. This is the Solipsism Trap, the philosophical vertigo that emerges when you recognize that your only direct access to reality is through your own subjective experience, that everything you know about the external world comes filtered through your senses and processed by your brain, leaving you with no unmediated window to verify that anything exists independent of your consciousness. The mechanism operates through the recognition that all evidence for external reality must somehow be perceived by you, must enter your awareness, which means you can never step outside your own mind to confirm that what you perceive corresponds to anything beyond it, creating a logical loop from which there seems to be no escape. Yet despite this being an intellectually valid concern, one that philosophers have grappled with for centuries, we navigate our daily lives almost entirely unburdened by it, moving through relationships and responsibilities as though other minds definitively exist, as though we have somehow solved a problem that may be fundamentally unsolvable. Suggesting that perhaps our confidence in external reality is not based on philosophical certainty, but rather on a deep evolutionary necessity to function. Imagine yourself as a child standing at the edge of a swimming pool at dusk, the water growing darker as the sun descends below the horizon, and despite knowing intellectually that nothing has changed about the pool itself, you feel an overwhelming sense of dread about entering that darkened water. The Grue Problem, named after the mysterious creature from the text-adventure game Zork that would devour you in the darkness, describes our irrational fear of the dark and the unknown that lurks within it, even when we possess complete knowledge that darkness itself poses no actual threat to our physical safety. What makes this problem philosophically fascinating is not merely the fear itself, but rather the stubborn persistence of that fear despite our absolute certainty that it is unfounded. You know with complete rational conviction that darkness is simply the absence of light, that it does not contain hidden monsters or malevolent entities waiting to consume you, yet your body responds with genuine terror nonetheless. The mechanism underlying this paradox involves the evolutionary preservation of ancient survival instincts that once kept our ancestors alive on the African savanna, where darkness truly did conceal predators and genuine threats to their existence. Your nervous system has inherited this ancestral programming, a deep biological legacy that continues to fire alarm signals in your brain regardless of your conscious understanding that your modern environment is safe, and that the darkness in your bedroom contains no actual danger. What makes the Grue Problem particularly unsettling is how thoroughly we have normalized this disconnect between knowledge and emotion, how we accept that millions of adults still sleep with night lights or keep their bedroom doors closed not out of any rational assessment of threat, but out of a primal discomfort that defies logical explanation. Consider the fundamental act that defines human existence, the decision to bring a new person into the world. Parents across every culture and era have engaged in this behavior with an almost universal assumption that they are conferring a gift upon their child, that existence itself is an inherent good worth experiencing. Yet David Benatar, a South African philosopher, has proposed a thought experiment so deceptively simple that it restructures how we might evaluate this most basic human choice. His antinatalist argument suggests that to bring someone into existence is to cause them to experience suffering, and that this act cannot be morally justified even when the resulting life contains genuine happiness and pleasure. The logic rests on an asymmetry. The absence of pain is good even if no one experiences this absence to appreciate it, while the absence of pleasure is not bad if no one exists to feel deprived of it. Therefore, never creating a conscious being eliminates all the suffering they would have endured without foregoing any actual good, since non-existent beings cannot be harmed by their non-existence. This framework transforms procreation from an act of creation into something more troubling, an imposition of inevitable hardship upon someone who never consented to participate in the human condition. The psychological mechanism that allows most people to dismiss or ignore this argument stems from an evolutionary bias toward reproduction and survival instincts that predate rational reflection. We are biologically programmed to seek continuation, to value life, to view the future as worth populating with new minds and bodies. Our entire emotional and social architecture rewards parenthood, celebrates pregnancy, mourns childlessness, and interprets the decision not to reproduce as deviant or tragic. Imagine a lamp that operates under a peculiar set of conditions established by the 20th century philosopher James Thomson. The lamp is switched on at 1 minute before midnight, then switched off at half a minute before midnight, then switched back on at a quarter minute before midnight, then switched off again at an eighth of a minute before midnight, and this process continues indefinitely, with each interval being half the length of the previous one. Each switching takes no time at all, occurring instantaneously, and the intervals between switches grow progressively smaller, approaching zero as we approach the stroke of midnight itself. The question that emerges from this scenario is deceptively simple yet philosophically devastating. When midnight arrives and all these infinite switching operations have been completed, is the lamp on or off? The thought experiment forces us to confront the nature of infinity, the relationship between infinite processes and their final states, and whether we can meaningfully determine an outcome from an infinite sequence of discrete actions. The lamp has been switched infinitely many times before we reach midnight, with no final switch to establish a definitive on or off state. There is no last action in the sequence, no ultimate switch that would determine the lamp's condition at the moment of midnight itself. This reveals a profound logical problem. Infinite sequences can be completed in the real world in terms of time passing, yet the operations they contain may lack a well-defined final state. We assume that if we perform an infinite number of actions one after another, there must be some resultant state, yet mathematics and logic suggest that such an assumption may be fundamentally flawed. The paradox persists not because the lamp is genuinely mystifying, but because we habitually expect that any sequence of discrete actions must conclude with a determinate outcome, that the world must settle into a. Imagine that you have discovered the secret to biological immortality, and you decide to live forever, never aging, never falling ill, never approaching the threshold of death no matter how much time passes. At first, this seems like an unambiguous blessing, a gift beyond measure, the answer to humanity's oldest prayer. You would have infinite time to master every skill, to read every book ever written, to travel to every corner of the world, to love deeply and repeatedly, to pursue every passion your heart could conceive. Yet as the centuries accumulate behind you like sediment, as you watch civilizations rise and crumble and rebuild themselves in endless cycles, as you attend the funerals of everyone you have ever loved, and then the funerals of the people who loved them, something unexpected begins to happen. The texture of experience flattens. Mountains you once found breathtakingly beautiful become mundane. Conversations with new people start to feel like conversations you have already had 1,000 times before, merely with different faces and names. Great artistic works that once moved you to tears now seem hollow and repetitive. The novelty that once made existence precious drains away, replaced by an exhausting sameness, an unbearable grayness that suffuses every moment regardless of what you're doing or where you are. This is the paradox of Immortality Tedium. The very thing we believe would make life infinitely valuable, infinite time itself, transforms into a psychological prison, a kind of existential exhaustion that no amount of pleasure or accomplishment can relieve. The mechanism at work here is deeply rooted in human neurology and consciousness. We experience meaning and intensity partly through scarcity and stakes, through the understanding that moments are finite and therefore precious. When those limitations vanish, when you genuinely know that you have forever, the pressure that creates urgency dissolves entirely. Imagine a lamp with a switch that can be flipped infinitely fast. At 1 minute before midnight, you flip the switch on. At 30 seconds before midnight, you flip it off. At 15 seconds before midnight, you flip it on again. At 7.5 seconds before midnight, you flip it off. Each action takes half the time of the previous one, and this pattern continues indefinitely, with each interval growing smaller and smaller, approaching but never quite reaching midnight. The question that emerges from this scenario is deceptively simple yet profoundly unsettling. When midnight arrives, is the lamp on or off? You have completed infinitely many actions in a finite span of time, which mathematicians call a supertask, and yet when you attempt to determine the final state of the lamp, you encounter a logical void. No matter how carefully you trace through the sequence, the lamp's final position remains fundamentally indeterminate because there is no final action to establish it. The last flip never occurs because the sequence has no last member, only an infinite convergence toward a moment that never actually contains a conclusion. This paradox reveals something deeply troubling about the nature of infinity and causation themselves, that our intuitions about how actions produce results break down completely when infinite sequences enter the picture. We assume that if you perform enough actions, you must arrive at some definite outcome, yet the supertask demonstrates that infinity can undermine this assumption entirely. The paradox persists in our thinking despite our sophisticated understanding of mathematics, because we continue to treat infinity as something we can meaningfully discuss as if it were just another number, another quantity that behaves according to familiar rules. Yet infinity is something categorically different, something that violates the ordinary logic of before and after, of cause and effect, of beginning and conclusion. Imagine a world in which millions of people exist, each living a deeply fulfilling and meaningful life, surrounded by genuine relationships and profound experiences that bring them joy and satisfaction. Now imagine that we could add to this world an enormous additional population of new people, each of whom would have lives barely worth living, existing in states of minimal consciousness, with experiences so diminished that they hover just above non-existence, yet technically containing some small positive value. The philosophical question that emerges from this scenario is whether we are morally obligated to create this second population simply because their lives contain some positive value, no matter how negligible. This is the core of what philosophers call the mere addition paradox, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about how we reason through population ethics. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment so troubling is that it exposes a logical contradiction lurking within our intuitions about morality. If we accept that we should always act to maximize total well-being across all people who exist, then adding billions of barely conscious entities seems morally required, yet our instincts rebel against this conclusion with fierce resistance. We intuitively feel that there is something deeply wrong with creating vast populations of people who suffer from diminished existence, yet our commitment to utilitarianism appears to demand exactly this outcome. The paradox persists because we have normalized a kind of moral reasoning that focuses exclusively on aggregate utility while simultaneously maintaining deeply held beliefs about human dignity and quality of life that seem to contradict such calculations. We live within this tension without fully acknowledging it, allowing both frameworks to coexist in our moral consciousness despite their fundamental incompatibility. Imagine stepping into a teletransportation chamber on Earth, where a scanner reads every atom in your body with perfect precision, records the exact quantum state of each molecule, and then transmits this complete blueprint across the vast distance of space to a receiver station on Mars. On the other side, a molecular assembler reconstructs your body atom by atom, creating what appears to be an identical copy of you, complete with all your memories, personality traits, and conscious experiences, while the original you in the chamber is disintegrated to prevent duplication. You close your eyes, experience a brief moment of disorientation, and when you open them again, you're standing on the red surface of Mars, looking at the blue dot of Earth in the sky, feeling completely yourself, with all your memories intact, certain that you have survived the journey. However, the unsettling philosophical question haunts the margins of this scenario. Was the person who arrived on Mars actually you, or merely a copy of you, while the original you, in some meaningful sense, died in the disintegration chamber on Earth? The thought experiment, formally articulated by the philosopher Derek Parfit, fractures our intuitions about personal identity and continuity of consciousness in ways that defy easy resolution. We have built our entire understanding of survival and death around the concept that there is a continuous thread of experience that persists through time, a single stream of consciousness that flows unbroken from birth to death. Yet this technology seems to sever that thread while simultaneously creating an exact replica that possesses every quality we typically associate with genuine survival. The deeper terror emerges when we recognize that if the transported version is genuinely you, then there is no morally relevant difference between copying and transport, which means we might casually create duplicates of ourselves for practical purpose. Imagine an infinite library that contains every possible book that could ever be written, stretching endlessly in all directions with hexagonal chambers connected by narrow corridors, each chamber lined floor to ceiling with identical volumes bound in cloth, each book filled with seemingly random combinations of letters arranged on precisely 410 pages, and somewhere within this impossible architecture exists every coherent thought ever conceived, every scientific discovery not yet made. Every meaningful conversation you might have had with someone you never met, every argument you lost phrased perfectly, every cure to every disease written in a language you do not speak. And crucially, the vast overwhelming majority of these books contain only gibberish, only meaningless strings of characters that form no words and convey no sense whatsoever. The psychological mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something profoundly unsettling about the human condition. If absolute knowledge exists but is buried beneath infinite noise, then knowledge becomes functionally equivalent to ignorance, and truth becomes indistinguishable from fiction when you cannot possibly locate either one. We have normalized this paradox in our contemporary existence through information overload, where the internet functions as our Library of Babel, containing theoretically all human knowledge but practically offering us no certainty about anything, where contradictory claims about health, history, and reality coexist indefinitely, each one potentially findable if you know where to look and what keywords to deploy. Yet the sheer volume of information guarantees that for every credible source you discover, countless fraudulent ones await, and we continue scrolling and searching anyway, behaving as though the answer to our question exists just beyond the next click, trapped in a cage of our own making where abundance has paradoxically become depriva. Imagine a prisoner who has been sentenced to death, and the judge delivers an unusual pronouncement. The execution will take place sometime during the following week, but the prisoner will not know which day until the morning of the execution itself, when guards arrive at their cell to carry out the sentence. The judge assures the prisoner that the hanging will be a genuine surprise, that there is no way to predict or deduce the exact day in advance. Now the prisoner begins to reason through this logically and arrives at what seems like an inescapable conclusion. The execution cannot possibly occur on Friday, because if it has not happened by Thursday evening, then the prisoner would know with certainty that it must be Friday, which would violate the condition that it must be a surprise. Working backwards from this reasoning, the prisoner concludes that Friday is impossible, which means the execution must occur by Thursday at the latest. But by the same logic, Thursday becomes impossible as well, because if the prisoner survives until Wednesday evening knowing that Thursday is the only remaining day, then the prisoner would know it was coming, again violating the surprise condition. This logical unraveling continues backwards through each day of the week, until the prisoner concludes that no day is possible, and therefore the execution cannot occur at all. Yet despite this seemingly airtight logical argument, when the guards arrive on, say, Wednesday morning, the prisoner is genuinely shocked and surprised, having reasoned themselves into a false sense of security. The paradox reveals a profound fracture in human reasoning where perfect logical deduction can lead us to conclusions that are contradicted by reality itself, forcing us to confront the possibility that our rational mind is incapable of fully grasping certain situations where knowledge, expectation, and certainty interact in paradoxical ways. Imagine standing in a conversation where someone asks you to define what goodness truly is, and you find yourself unable to provide a complete answer despite spending your entire life pursuing it. This is the essence of the open question argument, a philosophical puzzle that emerges whenever we attempt to reduce abstract moral concepts to concrete definitions or physical properties. When a moral philosopher proposes that goodness simply equals pleasure, or that moral rightness can be reduced to evolutionary fitness, a peculiar resistance arises in the mind, a sense that something essential has been left unsaid, that we could know all the facts about pleasure and still ask whether pleasure is actually good. This argumentative structure, formalized by G. Moore in his examination of naturalistic definitions of morality, reveals something unsettling about how we understand ethics and value. The mechanism operates through recognition that for any proposed definition of a moral term, we can always meaningfully ask whether that definition truly captures the thing itself, suggesting that moral properties might be fundamentally irreducible to physical or natural facts. What makes this thought experiment psychologically disturbing is not merely its logical structure, but rather what it implies about the foundations of our moral certainty, that our most deeply held ethical convictions may rest upon properties we cannot fully explain or locate in the natural world. We have built entire civilizations upon notions of good and evil, structured our laws and relationships around moral principles, yet the moment we try to pin down precisely what goodness is beneath the surface of our intuitions, the concept seems to slip away, remaining perpetually open to further questioning. Imagine standing at the edge of a river on a quiet morning, watching the water flow past your feet, and consider this simple observation. The river you see today is not the same river you saw yesterday, for the water that composed it has moved downstream, replaced by new water from upstream, and yet we persist in calling it by the same name, treating it as though it maintains some essential identity despite the complete turnover of its material substance. This was the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus's fundamental insight into the nature of reality, and it opens a peculiar door into questions about identity, persistence, and change that have haunted human consciousness for over 2,000 years. The river serves as a perfect metaphor for existence itself because everything in the universe behaves like this river. Your body replaces nearly all of its cells within 7 to 10 years. Your thoughts arise and vanish moment by moment. The atoms that compose your brain are constantly exchanged with the environment. And yet you move through the world convinced of your own continuous identity, calling yourself by the same name, believing yourself to be the same person who made promises yesterday and will keep them tomorrow. The philosophical mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something deeply unsettling about consciousness and identity. We have no coherent way to define what makes something the same object over time when nothing about it remains constant, and yet our survival depends on acting as though this continuity is real and meaningful. We have normalized this contradiction so thoroughly that questioning it feels almost absurd, and most people navigate their entire existence without ever confronting the vertigo of realizing that the self they consider continuous and unified is perhaps nothing more than a useful fiction, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of perpetual flux, a name we give to a river that is never the. Imagine that the universe is not merely expanding into an infinite void, but is instead moving inexorably toward a final moment of infinite complexity and knowledge, a moment so distant and so theoretically perfect that it functions as a kind of cosmic endpoint, drawing all of history toward itself like a gravitational singularity in reverse. This is the omega point, a concept developed by physicist Frank Tipler, which suggests that the universe is fundamentally teleological, that it has always been moving toward this ultimate conclusion where all information that has ever existed will be processed and preserved in a final state of perfect computational awareness. The terrifying implication here is not merely that our universe has a predetermined destiny, but that this final omega point, this ultimate moment of universal consciousness, can somehow reach backward through time, exerting a kind of retroactive influence on all preceding moments, including this one, making the future a more fundamental reality than the present or the past. We exist in this framework not as free agents making choices, but as necessary components in a vast computation that the future is running backward through time, using our very lives and decisions as the substrate for its own existence. The psychological mechanism operates through our fundamental discomfort with meaninglessness and chance, our deep need to believe that history is moving toward something, that our suffering and confusion serve some larger purpose, and that complexity and consciousness at the end of time will eventually redeem all the disorder and pain that came before. Despite the profound metaphysical strangeness of this idea, despite the fact that it inverts our ordinary understanding of causation and time, we find ourselves oddly comforted by it, drawn to the notion that we are threads in a tapestry being woven from both ends simultaneously, that the universe is intelligent at its conclusion if not. Consider the moment you sit alone in a darkened theater or beneath your bed covers with a book, and your heart begins to race as a fictional character faces mortal danger, despite your complete and certain knowledge that no actual person exists in peril, that no real suffering is occurring, and that you could close the book or leave the cinema at any instant and return to a world entirely unchanged by the narrative before you. Yet your pulse quickens nonetheless, and your breathing becomes shallow, and the emotional response floods through your nervous system with the same authenticity as if you were witnessing genuine tragedy unfold before your eyes. This is the paradox of fiction, and it reveals something profoundly unsettling about the architecture of human consciousness itself. The mechanism at work here is deceptively simple yet deeply mysterious. Your mind possesses the remarkable capacity to bifurcate your awareness into two simultaneous states, to hold in perfect balance both the knowledge that what you are experiencing is constructed and false, and the emotional conviction that it demands your genuine feeling and response. You know intellectually that Hamlet does not exist, that his suffering is merely language arranged on a page or actors speaking lines they have memorized, and yet something in the older, deeper portions of your brain responds to the simulation of his predicament as though it were real, as though the stakes were genuine and mattered in the material world. We have normalized this strange capability so thoroughly in our modern existence that we rarely pause to contemplate its extraordinary nature, the way we have collectively agreed to treat fictional suffering as worthy of real emotional investment, to spend hours caring deeply about people we know with absolute certainty are not real. Imagine a neuroscientist named Marcus who has spent his entire career studying color perception, and through decades of meticulous research, he has mapped every neural correlate of seeing red, every firing pattern, every synaptic connection, every chemical cascade that occurs in the brain when a person observes a crimson rose or a scarlet sunset. Marcus knows the complete physical story of red vision, and yet there remains one possibility that haunts him. What if, when he sees red, his subjective experience, his qualia, the redness as it appears to him from the inside, is actually nothing like what everyone else experiences when they see that same color? What if his internal sensation of red is closer to what you experience as blue, but he has learned to call it red because he was taught to point at roses and apples and say the word red just like everyone else, making his private experience forever invisible and undetectable? This is the thought experiment of absent qualia, and it suggests something profoundly unsettling, that the subjective qualities of our conscious experience might be completely disconnected from the objective, measurable physical facts about our brains. The mechanism underlying this possibility rests on a fundamental gap in our understanding of consciousness itself. We can describe every objective feature of neural activity, the wavelengths of light, the receptor responses, the neural firing patterns, yet none of these physical descriptions seem to logically necessitate any particular subjective feeling. The redness you experience when you see a rose exists only in your mind, and there appears to be no logical reason why that particular neural state must produce that particular feeling rather than some other feeling entirely. Two brains could be physically identical in every measurable way, yet the qualitative character of experience within them could differ radically, or one might have no subjective experience at all. Imagine you believe you know something to be true, and someone challenges you with evidence that contradicts it, yet you find yourself unable to genuinely engage with their counter-evidence, because accepting it would require dismantling an entire framework of beliefs you have constructed around the original claim. This is the essence of epistemic closure, a phenomenon where our existing knowledge claims become so tightly interwoven that we unconsciously treat them as immune from revision, even when presented with reasonable objections. The mechanism works like this. When we learn something new, we do not store it in isolation, but rather we integrate it into a vast network of other beliefs, assumptions, and conclusions that all depend upon one another for coherence and meaning. Once this network becomes sufficiently complex and personally invested with emotional or social significance, any threat to one foundational belief triggers an instinctive defensive response throughout the entire system, causing us to rationalize away inconsistencies rather than genuinely reconsider our positions. What makes this problem particularly unsettling is that it operates largely beneath conscious awareness. We experience our resistance to counter-evidence not as stubborn denial, but as rational skepticism toward what we perceive as flawed arguments or bad faith challenges. The closed epistemic system tells itself that it remains open to evidence, all while systematically filtering incoming information through an increasingly narrow aperture of acceptability. We have normalized this phenomenon so thoroughly in modern discourse that we rarely question its fundamental irrationality, instead attributing our inability to change minds to others' willful ignorance while remaining blind to our own participation in identical epistemic closure. Imagine for a moment that you are standing in a vast cosmic chamber, and before you materializes a machine of impossible design and purpose. This machine, were it to activate, would instantly show you your exact position in the universe, your significance relative to every atom, star, and living being that exists across all of time and space. The machine would reveal to you, with perfect mathematical precision, exactly how infinitesimally small you are, how utterly inconsequential your existence is in the grand scheme of reality, and how your concerns, ambitions, and struggles amount to less than the movement of a single grain of sand across an infinite desert. This thought experiment, borrowed from Douglas Adams's science fiction universe, represents a profound philosophical question about human consciousness and meaning. The machine does not show you anything false or distorted, it simply presents objective truth about your cosmic insignificance. Yet the mechanism by which this machine operates reveals something disturbing about the human mind itself. To comprehend your true place in the universe, to genuinely integrate this knowledge into your consciousness, would be to experience perfect clarity about the meaninglessness of existence. The thought experiment suggests that receiving this perspective would drive a person instantly mad, not because the information is wrong, but because human psychology is fundamentally incompatible with truly understanding our own irrelevance. We persist in a strange equilibrium, neither fully aware of our cosmic insignificance nor entirely ignorant of it. We have constructed elaborate systems of meaning, purpose, and significance that function precisely because we maintain a carefully calibrated blindness to the void. Imagine a kingdom where a massive dragon perches upon a mountain overlooking the realm, and this dragon demands a tribute of 1,000 human lives every single day, without fail or exception. The villagers accept this arrangement as simply the way things are, a permanent feature of existence that cannot be questioned or challenged, and they have organized their entire society around this horrific reality. They have developed elaborate systems to determine who will be sacrificed each day. They have created religions and philosophies that rationalize the dragon's hunger as natural and necessary, and they have even built monuments celebrating the dragon's power and majesty. The philosopher Nick Bostrom, who conceived this thought experiment, uses the dragon as a metaphor for preventable human death and suffering in our own world, asking us to consider whether our acceptance of this daily carnage differs fundamentally from the kingdom's acceptance of their dragon's demands. The mechanism at work here involves a psychological phenomenon known as normalization of the unacceptable, wherein we become so accustomed to ongoing tragedy that we cease to perceive it as tragic at all. Death from aging, disease, and decay kills hundreds of thousands of people every single day in our world, yet we speak of this as a natural inevitability rather than as a catastrophe we ought to mobilize all our resources to prevent and overcome. We name it destiny, we mark it as the human condition, we write poetry about its inevitability, and we rarely stop to ask whether a civilization that possessed sufficient knowledge and resources, yet chose not to extend human lifespan, would be morally indistinguishable from Bostrom's villagers feeding innocents to their dragon. The terror of this fable lies not in any fantastic creature, but in the recognition that our own complacency toward vast preventable suffering may be precisely as irrational as the kingdom's acceptank. Imagine a village where shepherds share a common pasture, a green field that belongs to no one individual but sustains the entire community's livestock. Each shepherd understands, in theory, that the pasture has a finite capacity, a maximum number of animals it can support before the grass becomes depleted and the land degrades beyond recovery. Yet each shepherd also understands that if they add one more sheep to their own flock, they personally gain the full benefit of that animal's wool and meat, while the cost of overgrazing is distributed among all the villagers equally. The rational calculation becomes unavoidable. The individual shepherd benefits entirely from their own additions, while bearing only a fraction of the shared consequences. So each shepherd adds another sheep, and another, convinced that their single contribution barely matters. But every shepherd thinks identically, every shepherd makes this same rational choice in isolation, and the result is catastrophic. The pasture becomes overgrazed, the grass disappears, the soil erodes, and eventually the commons collapses entirely, leaving the community with nothing. What makes this scenario philosophically terrifying is that it requires no malice, no stupidity, no moral failing on anyone's part. Each individual actor is behaving with perfect rationality according to their own self-interest, yet their collective rationality produces collective irrationality, a paradox that undermines our basic assumption about how civilization functions. We see this pattern replicated endlessly across human systems. Fisheries collapse because each fishing company maximizes their own catch, while the ocean's capacity diminishes for everyone. The atmosphere warms because each nation and corporation rationally pursues growth, while the shared planetary system absorbs the shared cost. Public spaces decay because maintaining them benefits everyone equally while the effort required belongs to. Imagine that you own a wooden ship, the vessel that carried you across oceans and through storms, a ship so familiar that every plank and nail feels like an extension of yourself. Over time, the wood begins to rot. A plank deteriorates beyond repair, so you replace it with new timber. Then another plank fails, and another until gradually, across months or years, every single piece of the original ship has been removed and replaced with fresh wood. Standing before you now is a ship that is materially, physically identical in every way to the original, yet composed entirely of different substance. The question that haunts us is simple but profound. Is this still your ship? Meanwhile, you discover that someone has collected every single plank you removed over the years and has painstakingly reassembled them into the original configuration. Which ship is truly yours? The continuously maintained vessel you have always sailed, or the reconstructed artifact made from the original materials? This paradox strikes at the heart of identity and persistence across time, forcing us to confront what we actually mean when we claim something remains itself despite transformation. We treat objects and even ourselves as unified, continuous entities, yet scrutiny reveals this to be a kind of conceptual fiction we have constructed. The psychological mechanism underlying our certainty is deeply rooted in continuity and context. We follow the continuously maintained ship because it preserves an unbroken causal and spatial narrative. We watched each replacement occur, we sailed upon it throughout. Yet the material argument for the reconstructed ship is equally compelling in its own way. Our commitment to either answer reveals what we truly value: narrative continuity or material substance. What makes this terrifying is not the puzzle itself, but our realization that we apply this same flawed reasoning to ourselves without hesitation. Consider the moment you sit down to a meal of chicken or beef, never once questioning the moral status of the animal whose flesh you consume. Yet if someone suggested eating dog meat in your presence, you would likely recoil with visceral disgust and moral outrage. And this inconsistency at the heart of our dietary choices reveals something deeply troubling about how we categorize moral worth based on arbitrary biological classifications rather than morally relevant characteristics. The Speciesism Argument, articulated most clearly by philosophers like Peter Singer, asks us to confront the uncomfortable reality that we grant full moral consideration to members of our own species while systematically denying it to other animals who possess the very capacities we claim justify moral status. The ability to feel pain, to suffer, to experience fear, to prefer living over dying. We have constructed an elaborate moral architecture that protects dogs and cats while normalizing the industrial breeding, confinement, and slaughter of pigs and cows, creatures whose cognitive and emotional complexity rivals or exceeds that of the animals we cherish as companions. Yet we partition these beings into different moral categories based solely on species membership, a distinction that functions no differently than partitioning humans by race or nationality once functioned. The psychological mechanism that sustains this contradiction operates through a combination of cognitive dissonance management and social habituation. We distance ourselves from the reality of animal agriculture through euphemistic language, through the spatial separation of slaughterhouses from shopping centers, through the transformation of animals into abstract products labeled as meat rather than flesh, and through generations of cultural conditioning that presents our current practices as natural and inevitable rather than as the products of specific choices we could abandon. Imagine a creature so perfectly designed by evolution that merely looking upon it results in instantaneous death, a phenomenon so absolute that no organism has ever survived the encounter to warn others of what they saw. And yet we know it exists because we can infer its existence from the very fact that nothing has ever looked at it and lived to describe the experience. This is the logical paradox at the heart of the basilisk's eye, a thought experiment that asks us to consider how we can be certain of the deadliness of something we cannot possibly observe without dying, and more deeply, how our consciousness might be shaped by threats we can never actually verify. The mechanism underlying this paradox operates on the principle of unfalsifiable certainty, where the very conditions that would allow us to test a hypothesis are mutually exclusive with our survival, creating a wall of logical impossibility that our minds nonetheless find compelling and terrifying. We find ourselves in the peculiar position of being absolutely convinced of a danger that cannot, by definition, ever present evidence of itself to us, and we organize our behavior and beliefs around this invisible threat that operates entirely in the realm of inference and assumption. What makes this thought experiment particularly unsettling is how it mirrors our relationship with countless real phenomena in the modern world. From risks we cannot directly observe like radiation and atmospheric toxins to existential threats like artificial intelligence or unforeseen consequences of technologies we have already deployed into society, where our certainty about danger grows precisely as our ability to directly observe it diminishes. We have somehow normalized this state of anxiety about imperceptible threats, accepting that much of our decision-making must be based on the logical extrapolation of evidence we cannot see rather than direct sensory confirmation, and yet we rarely acknowledge. Consider the moment when you truly attempt to construct meaning from nothing, when you sit alone with the recognition that the universe operates according to physical laws entirely indifferent to your existence, your values, your suffering, or your accomplishments. You begin to notice that every framework you have inherited for understanding purpose, religion, career ambition, family legacy, artistic creation, moral philosophy, rests upon assumptions you can no longer take for granted once you have glimpsed their contingency. The thought experiment unfolds not as a paradox to solve, but as a descent, where you realize that nothing you do produces lasting significance in a cosmos that will eventually cool into darkness, where civilizations will be erased as completely as footprints in sand, and where your most cherished beliefs are merely electrochemical patterns in meat that will one day cease functioning entirely. The mechanism operates through a kind of logical recursion, where every answer to the question, "Why should I value this?" can be met with another, "Why should I value that reason?" And this chain continues downward indefinitely until you reach the foundation of your own consciousness, which offers no ultimate justification for its own existence. You find yourself trapped in a peculiar paradox where the very capacity to recognize meaninglessness requires a mind capable of reflecting on its own insignificance. Yet this reflection itself seems to demand some form of value, some reason to undertake the exhausting work of thought itself. What persists is the strange fact that despite this recognition, humans continue to act as though meaning exists, continue to wake in the morning, continue to love and create and strive, not because logic compels them to do so, but because the machinery of consciousness and biology operates regardless of its own theoretical justification. Carrying us forward into a future, we construct meaning for even as we know. Imagine you are offered a simple game of chance, one that begins with a coin flip and promises an extraordinary reward structure that escalates with each successive outcome. The game works like this: a fair coin is flipped repeatedly, and if it lands on heads on the first flip, you receive $2 and the game ends, but if it lands on tails, the coin is flipped again, and this time if heads appears, you receive $4, yet if tails emerges once more, you flip again where heads grants you $8, and this pattern continues infinitely with the payout doubling each round. The question that emerges is deceptively simple. How much money would you rationally be willing to pay in advance to play this game just once? Mathematically, the expected value of this game is infinite, because you must sum an endless series of probabilities multiplied by their corresponding payouts, yielding half times 2 plus 1/4 times 4 plus 1/8 times 8, and so forth, an arithmetic sequence that grows without bound. Yet when surveyed, most rational people refuse to pay more than a few dollars to participate, perhaps $15 or $20 at most, creating a stark and troubling disconnect between mathematical expectation and human intuition. The paradox reveals a fundamental tension within decision theory itself, the gap between what our calculable reason insists we should value and what our lived experience of risk, uncertainty, and practical limitation tells us is reasonable. We struggle to reconcile the idea that something theoretically infinite in value feels worthless in reality, and this discomfort stems from our implicit understanding that infinite payouts are themselves infinitely unlikely to occur, that the compounding rarity of needing endless coin flips makes the astronomical rewards virtually impossible to reach. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the entire universe, in all of its apparent age and complexity, was created merely moments ago with a complete false history already built into it. This is the essence of the Omphalos Hypothesis, first proposed by Philip Henry Goss in 1857 as a response to the growing scientific evidence that Earth was far older than traditional religious chronologies suggested. Goss argued that God, in creating the world, would necessarily have created it with an appearance of age, much like a mature tree planted in a garden would already possess rings in its trunk despite having just been created, or how Adam himself would have been born fully formed rather than as an infant. The hypothesis suggests that all the geological strata, fossil records, starlight from distant galaxies, and radiometric dating evidence we observe today were simply created as part of the initial act of creation, deliberately constructed to appear as though billions of years had passed when in fact the entire cosmos might be only hours or days old. What makes this thought experiment philosophically terrifying is not merely its logical consistency, but rather its fundamental unfalsifiability. For if the universe was indeed created with a false history embedded within it, there would be no conceivable way to detect this deception. No experiment that could distinguish between a universe that is genuinely ancient and one that only appears to be ancient by design. This renders the hypothesis simultaneously unfalsifiable and virtually impossible to disprove through any empirical means, creating a kind of epistemic trap where we cannot even trust the evidence of our own observations and instruments. The deeper horror lies in contemplating what this means for knowledge itself, for if reality can be constructed with an entirely fabricated past, then the very foundation of how we understand causation, history, and the reliability. Imagine waking in the morning with absolute certainty about the world around you, the solidity of your memories, the reliability of your senses, and the very nature of reality itself, only to confront the possibility that none of it exists as you perceive it. This is the essence of the Cartesian evil genius thought experiment, a philosophical construct that emerges from the meditations of René Descartes, who proposed that we might be systematically deceived by a powerful malevolent entity that manipulates our every perception, our every thought, and our every sensory experience with perfect precision. The evil genius need not be supernatural or cosmic in nature. It could theoretically be an advanced artificial intelligence, a brain in a vat receiving carefully orchestrated electrical impulses, or simply an incomprehensibly powerful being devoted entirely to the project of deception. What makes this thought experiment so profoundly unsettling is not merely its logical possibility, but rather the absolute impossibility of ever disproving it from within the bounds of your own subjective experience. Every piece of evidence you might marshal against the deception could itself be part of the deception, creating an infinite regress of doubt that seems to dissolve all certainty. The psychological mechanism at work here exploits a fundamental vulnerability in human knowledge, our complete dependence on our cognitive apparatus to evaluate the reliability of that very apparatus. When you attempt to verify whether your perceptions are genuine, you must use your perceptions, your memory, and your reasoning capacity, all of which could themselves be compromised. This creates a logical trap from which there appears to be no escape, a closure of doubt that renders all external knowledge fundamentally questionable, yet somehow we persist in living our lives with unshakable confidence despite this lurking uncertainty. Imagine a person who has arrived at a complete and rational understanding that life has no inherent meaning, that the universe operates according to indifferent physical laws, that consciousness is ultimately insignificant in the vast expanse of cosmic time, and yet they wake up each morning and continue living as though none of this is true. They go to work, they maintain relationships, they pursue goals, they invest emotional energy in outcomes that they intellectually know do not matter. This is philosophical suicide, a concept articulated by the philosopher Albert Camus, and it represents perhaps one of the most unsettling contradictions embedded within human existence. The thought experiment asks us to confront the peculiar psychological state of a being who fully comprehends the absurdity of existence, but deliberately chooses to live in denial of that knowledge rather than face its logical conclusion. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through a kind of cognitive compartmentalization, wherein the rational mind acknowledges meaninglessness while the living body and emotional self continue to generate purpose, desire, and engagement with the world. We become philosophers by day, confronting the abyss and understanding its implications, yet we become animals by night, sleeping peacefully despite having glimpsed the void. What makes this truly terrifying is not merely the recognition of meaninglessness, but rather the realization that we cannot actually live according to our intellectual conclusions, that rational knowledge and lived experience exist in perpetual conflict within consciousness. We have normalized this contradiction so completely that we no longer recognize it as a form of suicide at all, a gradual death of authentic self-awareness, replaced instead by comfortable self-deception that we mistake for wisdom or maturity. Imagine a composer from the 21st century who travels backward in time and gives Beethoven the complete manuscripts of the Ninth Symphony, note for note, before Beethoven himself could have written it, and then returns to the future, where history records that Beethoven composed this masterpiece of his own genius and effort. The symphony exists, it is undeniably real, yet neither the composer from the future nor Beethoven from the past actually created it, and somehow the information required to compose it simply appears in the timeline without ever being generated by anyone. This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our fundamental understanding of causality, creation, and the origin of information itself. The paradox reveals a terrifying logical impossibility. If information can travel through time, then it becomes possible for that information to exist without ever being created, existing in a causal loop where every participant in the loop points to another participant as the originator, yet no actual origination ever occurs. The implications extend far beyond science fiction scenarios, suggesting that in a universe where time travel is theoretically possible, the very concept of creation becomes meaningless, and information might simply circulate eternally without source or author. Our minds struggle with this because we are accustomed to linear causality, to the reassuring notion that everything has a beginning, that information must be generated somewhere by someone with intention and effort. Yet the Bootstrap Paradox demonstrates that such assumptions might be merely comforting fictions we impose upon reality rather than inherent features of how the universe actually functions at its deepest levels. If we accept this possibility, then the question of whether a universe permits time travel becomes inseparable from the question of whether it permits genuine creation at all, forcing us to reconsider whether. Imagine a person whose entire life philosophy rests upon the pursuit of pleasure, who wakes each morning with the singular intention of maximizing their own happiness and enjoyment, who carefully plans their days around activities designed to bring them the greatest possible satisfaction and delight. This person seeks out entertainment, indulges in their favorite foods, pursues romantic encounters, accumulates wealth to buy beautiful things, and structures every decision around the fundamental principle that pleasure is the ultimate good and the only rational purpose of existence. Yet despite this relentless and methodical pursuit of happiness, this person often finds themselves profoundly unhappy, anxious, and unfulfilled, discovering that the very happiness they chased so deliberately remains perpetually out of reach, always receding just beyond the horizon of their grasp. This is the paradox of hedonism, a logical contradiction that emerges when we examine the nature of human motivation and desire with unforgiving clarity. The mechanism works like this. Happiness and pleasure, when pursued as direct targets, tend to elude us precisely because we are pursuing them, much like trying to fall asleep by desperately willing yourself to sleep, or trying to remember a forgotten word by straining your memory harder. The moment we make pleasure itself the conscious object of our pursuit, we create a self-defeating loop where we become hyper-aware of whether we are actually achieving pleasure. We begin measuring and evaluating our experiences against an imagined standard of perfect satisfaction, and we inadvertently introduce anxiety and self-consciousness into moments that require genuine spontaneity and immersion. Happiness appears to arrive most naturally as a byproduct of engaging in meaningful activities, relationships, pursuits of purpose, or even the pursuit of other people's welfare, rather than as a direct result of targeting it alone. Consider a single grain of sand placed before you on a table and ask yourself a simple question: does this constitute a heap? The answer intuitively is no. One grain is not a heap. Now add another grain beside it. 2 grains are still not a heap. Add a third grain and we maintain the same conclusion. 3 grains do not form a heap. Continue this process methodically, grain after grain, adding them one at a time to your growing collection, and at each step ask whether we have yet crossed the threshold into heap territory. At what precise moment does this transition occur? When does the addition of a single grain transform a non-heap into a heap? The troubling reality is that no such moment exists, yet we know with certainty that at some point, after thousands or millions of grains, we unquestionably possess a heap. This is the Sorites Paradox, an ancient problem that reveals the profound instability lurking beneath our most basic linguistic and conceptual categories. The paradox works by exploiting the vagueness inherent in our language, the fact that terms like heap, bald, tall, and old lack precise boundaries. We accept that removing a single hair from a bald person does not transform them into a non-bald person, yet through repeated individual removals, we inevitably arrive at someone with a full head of hair. The logical mechanism is devastatingly simple. If we cannot identify the exact threshold where a property begins or ends, then our ordinary language appears to permit contradiction, for we seem forced to conclude both that heaps exist and that no accumulation of non-heaps can create one. What makes this paradox so psychologically unsettling is that we have normalized our relationship with vagueness so completely that we rarely acknowledge its presence or its implications for how we understand reality itself. Consider the experience of looking at your own hand, that familiar assemblage of flesh and bone that you have relied upon your entire life to interact with the world, and ask yourself whether it truly exists as a unified object or whether what you are actually observing is merely a collection of atoms held temporarily in proximity by physical forces. Mereological nihilism is the philosophical position that objects composed of parts do not genuinely exist as wholes, that only fundamental particles or atoms possess true existence, and that our everyday perception of chairs and tables and bodies is a convenient fiction we have constructed to navigate reality. When you reach out to hold a cup of water, the nihilist contends that there is no cup and no water in any meaningful metaphysical sense, only a vast collection of subatomic particles arranged in a particular configuration that our brains have evolved to perceive and reference as a unified thing. The mechanism underlying this unsettling thought rests upon a logical problem called the composition question, which asks how exactly individual parts combine to form a genuine whole. And if we cannot provide a satisfying answer to that question, then perhaps we must accept that composition never truly occurs at all. What makes this thought experiment particularly disorienting is how it seems to flatten the distinction between real objects and arbitrary collections, suggesting that there is no meaningful difference between a statue and the clay from which it is formed, or between your body and the atoms scattered throughout space that merely happen to be assembled into a body shape. We persist in our ordinary lives treating objects as if they genuinely exist because doing so is pragmatically useful, and because abandoning this assumption would render almost all language and thought incoherent, yet the logical arguments underlying Mereological nihilism remain unanswered, lurking beneath our shared. Imagine yourself standing beside a railway track where a runaway trolley barrels toward 5 people who cannot escape, and you stand near a lever that can divert it onto another track where it will kill only one person instead. The choice seems clear, and most people pull the lever, reasoning that sacrificing one to save 5 represents a mathematical good. But now consider a variation where instead of a lever, you stand on a bridge above the tracks next to a large stranger, and the only way to stop the trolley from killing those 5 people is to push this innocent person off the bridge onto the tracks below, where their body will stop the trolley and save the 5 at the cost of that one life. Suddenly, most people recoil from this choice, despite the mathematics being identical. This is the essence of the trolley problem and its variants, a family of thought experiments that reveals a fundamental disconnect between our conscious moral reasoning and the intuitive judgments that actually govern our decisions. The variants multiply endlessly, each one stripping away details to isolate what truly influences our choices, whether it involves transplanting organs from one healthy person to save 5 dying patients, or whether the action is omission rather than commission, whether we know the victim or remain anonymous to them, whether our hands must touch them, or whether we need only redirect an existing force. What makes these scenarios so psychologically arresting is that they expose the gap between utilitarian logic, which suggests we should always maximize good outcomes, and deontological instinct, which insists that some actions are inherently wrong regardless of consequences. We discover that our moral intuitions are not unified principles at all, but rather a collection of conflicting impulses shaped by evolution, culture, and the emotional distance between ourselves and potential victims. Imagine yourself standing at a crossroads in your life where you made a choice that led to your current circumstances, and now consider with absolute clarity that if you had chosen differently at any of dozens of critical moments, you would have experienced an entirely different life, perhaps one filled with greater suffering or loss. And this realization that you narrowly avoided catastrophe through pure chance becomes the dominant feature of your consciousness as you contemplate all the branching paths you did not take. The thought experiment of Counterfactual Doom invites us to recognize that our existence is perpetually suspended above an abyss of alternative timelines where marginally different decisions would have produced radically worse outcomes, and yet we walk through our days with a curious blindness to this fundamental fragility. Consider the person who left their job 1 week before the company collapsed, or who avoided a particular route that would have resulted in a fatal accident, or who met their life partner only because they decided to attend an event they almost skipped, and recognize how every single moment of relative security rests upon an invisible foundation of near misses and fortunate contingencies that could have unfolded differently. The mechanism that makes this thought experiment psychologically destabilizing is that human beings naturally construct narratives of agency and control, telling ourselves that our choices matter and that we steer our own destinies. Yet when we genuinely contemplate the counterfactual alternatives with honesty, we discover that most of the crucial determinants of our well-being depend on circumstances entirely beyond our influence. The timing of our birth, the random placement of our family in a particular geography, the unpredictable sequences of events that brought our parents together in the first place. Imagine you walk into a casino and observe a roulette wheel that has landed on red 23 times in a row, a genuinely extraordinary occurrence that defies statistical expectation. The inverse gambler's fallacy would lead you to conclude that because such an improbable sequence has already occurred, the wheel itself must be biased, or that some special property exists within the system that produced this outcome, when in reality, the wheel is behaving exactly as randomly as it always has been. This fallacy reverses the traditional gambler's mistake by using past results not to predict future outcomes, but rather to retroactively assign causation or bias to the mechanism that generated those results. Where the standard gambler's fallacy might lead you to bet against red after seeing it appear repeatedly, the inverse version leads you to believe that the appearance of such a sequence proves something special about the wheel itself, that it must somehow be weighted or influenced in ways you cannot see. The psychological mechanism underlying this error stems from our deeply rooted need to find patterns and assign meaning to randomness, to believe that extraordinary outcomes must have extraordinary causes. Our minds resist the notion that truly random systems can produce wildly improbable sequences through pure chance alone, and so when confronted with evidence of such sequences, we feel compelled to retrofit our understanding of reality to accommodate them. We transform apparent accidents into evidence of hidden mechanisms, turning statistical anomalies into proof of non-existent biases. This fallacy persists because we find genuine randomness philosophically and emotionally intolerable, and we have built entire systems of reasoning around the assumption that outcomes reveal something about their underlying causes, even when the mathematics insists otherwise. Consider the person you were 10 years ago, their beliefs, their fears, their desires, the very substance of their personality, and recognize that nearly every atom in your body has been replaced since then, that your memories have been edited and reconstructed countless times, that your values have shifted in directions you might not have predicted, and yet you maintain an unshakable conviction that you are still fundamentally the same person who existed a decade in the past. This is the paradox of personal identity erosion, the gradual, relentless replacement of every component that constitutes yourself while maintaining the persistent illusion of continuity. Your cells die and regenerate in cycles measured in weeks and months rather than years, meaning that the physical substrate of your consciousness bears almost no resemblance to what it was in your childhood, and yet you experience yourself as continuous. Your memories, the very anchors you believe tether you to your past self, are unreliable reconstructions that change shape each time you recall them, influenced by your current emotional state, by suggestion, by the simple passage of time, and yet you trust them implicitly as proof of your persistent identity. Your personality evolves through experience and circumstance, your political beliefs transform through exposure to new ideas, your sense of humor shifts, your tolerance for pain adjusts, your capacity for love deepens or narrows, and the person who emerges from these accumulated changes is demonstrably different from who you were, and yet society insists that you remain accountable for the actions of your former self. That you bear responsibility for promises made by someone who no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The mechanism underlying this erosion operates without our awareness. Each moment of consciousness fades into the past, becoming a memory that is itself subject to decay and reinvention, while a new moment. Consider the precise moment when you become aware that nothing you do ultimately matters, that your individual actions dissolve into the indifference of an uncaring universe, and that even your deepest convictions and most meaningful relationships will eventually be erased by time's relentless passage into absolute nothingness. This is the experience of confronting Nihil Unbound, a thought experiment that explores what happens when we truly internalize that nothing possesses inherent meaning, that all value systems are human constructs we've arbitrarily assigned to arbitrary things, and that the universe operates according to physical laws that were never designed with human flourishing in mind. The mechanism at work here involves recognizing that your entire existence, your relationships, your accomplishments, and your suffering all function within a framework where ultimate purpose simply does not exist outside the significance you've temporarily granted them. You continue forward through your days because you have evolved to find meaning in small things, to bond with others, to pursue goals. Yet the underlying foundation supporting these pursuits is revealed as fundamentally hollow when examined closely enough, a constructed scaffold with nothing supporting it from below. What makes this thought experiment particularly unsettling is that most people continue their lives without genuinely confronting this reality, moving through routines and relationships and ambitions as though the absence of cosmic meaning doesn't apply to them, as though their particular pursuits have somehow escaped the universal condition of meaninglessness that governs everything else. We have normalized this contradiction by simply not thinking about it deeply, by maintaining a kind of willful ignorance where we acknowledge intellectually that nothing matters while emotionally investing ourselves as though everything does, creating an internal schism that we've learned to. Consider the moment you begin to doubt your own thoughts, examining why you believe what you believe, only to find yourself asking why you believe that reason, and then why you believe that reason for that reason, descending endlessly into layers of justification that never seem to reach solid ground. This is the infinite regress, a philosophical catastrophe that emerges whenever we demand a complete explanation for anything at all. In our everyday lives, we experience this most acutely when confronting questions of knowledge and causation, asking what caused this event, and then what caused that cause, spiraling backward through time without ever arriving at a first cause or an unmoved mover. The mechanism operates like this. Every explanation requires a prior explanation. Every justification demands a deeper justification. Every answer spawns a new question that seems equally legitimate and equally demanding of resolution. We cannot simply declare that something is self-evident or foundational without violating our own rational standards, yet we cannot possibly complete an infinite chain of reasoning before breakfast. This creates a peculiar psychological tension in the human mind, for we are creatures who desperately crave complete understanding, yet we are trapped in a logical prison of our own making. What makes this thought experiment particularly terrifying is not merely that infinite regress seems logically unavoidable, but that we have somehow learned to live with it anyway, constructing elaborate systems of belief and knowledge while studiously avoiding the question of what grounds those systems themselves. We accept explanations that are good enough, reasons that feel sufficient, and justifications that appear adequate without ever confronting the abyss beneath them, as though acknowledging the infinite descent might cause the entire structure of meaning to collapse beneath us. Consider the moment when you find yourself reading a scientific paper about human behavior, observing with clinical precision how people act in certain situations, and then immediately afterward you close the paper and think to yourself about how people ought to behave, how society should function, what is right and what is wrong. This invisible transition from description to prescription, from what is to what ought to be, represents the fundamental problem that the Scottish philosopher David Hume identified centuries ago, a distinction so profound that it has come to be known as Hume's guillotine. The thought experiment asks you to notice the exact moment when facts become values, when objective observations somehow transform into moral imperatives without any logical bridge connecting them. You might observe that humans are naturally selfish creatures, driven primarily by self-interest and survival instinct, and this is simply a factual description of our evolutionary heritage and psychological makeup. Yet from this same fact, one person might conclude that we ought to act selfishly and pursue only our own benefit, while another person might insist that we ought to overcome our selfish nature and embrace altruism and community. The same factual premise generates contradictory moral conclusions, which suggests that neither conclusion actually derives from the premise at all. What makes this thought experiment so quietly terrifying is that it reveals how completely we construct our moral worlds from nothing, how we smuggle values into our reasoning without ever noticing the contraband, how every statement about how the world should be contains an invisible leap that has no logical foundation whatsoever. We do this constantly in everyday conversation, moving from discussing what is happening in the world to what we believe should happen, as though these two domains operate in the same logical space, when in fact they exist in fundamentally. Every morning you wake to the sunrise, and you know with certainty that the sun will rise tomorrow. Every time you have stepped off a cliff, you have fallen downward, and you expect gravity to work the same way tomorrow. Every person you have ever known has eventually died, and you assume that you too will face mortality. These expectations feel as solid as the ground beneath your feet, yet they rest upon a foundation that logic cannot fully justify. The problem of induction asks a deceptively simple question. Why should the past predict the future at all? You observe patterns, yes, countless instances of the same outcome repeating under similar circumstances, and your mind naturally extrapolates these patterns forward into time that has not yet occurred. But nowhere in the observation itself does the future become guaranteed. 1,000 sunrises do not logically necessitate 1,001st. A million instances of gravity pulling objects downward cannot prove that gravity will persist in the next moment. The philosopher David Hume identified this gap between observation and expectation as the core of human reasoning, yet he could not bridge it with pure logic. Your entire existence operates on the assumption that nature operates uniformly, that tomorrow will follow the laws of today, that breakfast will nourish you as it did yesterday, because the biological mechanisms that processed food yesterday will process it identically today. Yet this assumption itself cannot be proven without circular reasoning, without already assuming that past instances of reasoning being correct means future instances will also be correct. You navigate the world confidently despite this logical void underneath it. You catch a falling object without hesitation because you have internalized the pattern of gravity so deeply that the possibility of it suddenly reversing never enters your conscious mind. Consider the moment when you pause in the middle of your day and ask yourself why you are doing what you are doing, and then ask why that reason matters, and then ask why mattering itself has any significance, and find yourself descending into a peculiar kind of cognitive vertigo where each answer only generates another question. Each justification only reveals another layer of potential meaninglessness beneath it. Until you arrive at a point where you cannot find any ultimate ground for why anything you do has any cosmic importance whatsoever. This is the experience of confronting the meaningless void, and it strikes many people with surprising force despite the fact that, logically speaking, we have always known this truth at some level. The mechanism at work here is that human consciousness evolved to operate within bounded contexts where meaning appears self-evident. You eat because you are hungry, you protect your children because they are your children, you work because you need resources, you build communities because belonging feels intrinsically valuable. These immediate, local reasons for action feel completely sufficient in moment-to-moment experience, and so we rarely step back to ask whether any of it matters in an absolute sense, whether the universe cares about your survival or your happiness or your legacy. Yet when we do ask, when we deliberately zoom out far enough to see ourselves as temporary arrangements of matter on an insignificant planet circling an ordinary star in an incomprehensibly vast cosmos where heat-death awaits all things, the meaning we had constructed reveals itself to be constructed, contingent, ultimately grounded in nothing but our own projection. What is remarkable is how we continue to live as though this void does not exist, how we have collectively agreed to ignore this recognition and proceed with our days as if they matter, as if our choices resonate with some kind of significance beyond the pure.